Welcome to episode 5 of An Understanding. This episode will be about James Monroe. If you guys want to listen, listen. If you don't, eat biscuits. Otherwise, enjoy. Who is James Monroe? Well, weird voice that I keep doing. James Monroe was at one time the Secretary of State for James Madison and also our 5th President of the United States. An underrated one, and one that I think is kind of obscure in history, to be honest with you. I mean, honestly, aside from, the Monroe Doctrine, a lot of people don't even know really who James Monroe is, much less that he's, our president. Yet, he's also, I would probably say, one of the most influential founding fathers, at the very least, a part of this second generation of founding fathers who has this gross influence, overall within politics for the better part of, at least 30 years for the most part. At least, when he first enters politics. James Monroe has been a part of history, in American history, for his entire life. And what I mean is this. Everyone knows the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. It was actually painted by European artist, I believe a German artist, Emanuel Lutz. It's actually really kind of brilliant. His work is really deep, brilliant. He's I guess you could say, a classical liberal-minded individual who wants to fight for revolution, freedom, and all that. And he painted this picture, because most people attribute it, to the time of the era, that he was in Europe, specifically in the 1850s, when the liberal revolution and the labor reforms were coming along, and all sorts of and solved just all sorts of parts of the world for the most part, and the destruction of the aristocracy for more liberal and democratic forms of government. Anyways, he painted this painting with Washington. It's the most famous depiction of Washington crossing the Delaware. It's probably not the most accurate, but in the boat that Washington's in, there's a man holding the flag, and it's been debunked at this point. Monroe was not on that boat, but a lot of people, and I personally like to attribute it to just, for sheer fantasy, that the man holding that flag was James Monroe. James Monroe is the last notable, I would say, founding father, aside from probably John Marshall, who would be able to live long enough to, who actually served within the actual Revolutionary War itself, who actually lived a very long life, and well into the actual 1820s for the most part, to influence politics in his specific way. Monroe's a part of history. He's a part of so many moments that you don't even really cognizantly think about, I mean, if anyone knows about the Hamilton play for the most part, or has seen it, and the whole Reynolds affair, the truth is the play doesn't really go into that. They don't really bring up James Monroe, unfortunately. The truth is James Monroe is probably the person who intentionally or unintentionally is the one who exposed it, for, whatever your personal opinion is of Monroe and depiction and interpretation of those specific events. James Monroe is one of the most interesting founding fathers, only because he's one to really difficult to figure out. He's probably the least, I don't even want to say written about, but it's probably how do I explain it? He's the least known founding father, at least in terms of a personality perspective, and he's difficult to read, I guess you could say. I mean, to this day, most of us don't even really understand or really know his perception on religion for the most part. I mean, he was probably just a regular Episcopalian like many of the other founding fathers, but at the very same end of the spectrum, he doesn't really talk about religion. He doesn't really bring up religion. A lot of his writing, it's fascinating, He keeps things close to the vest. And in a lot of ways, he's kind of like the closest thing to George Washington, if George Washington were, I would say, on the other side of the ideological and political spectrum. Ironically, as well, Monroe would be the actual closest thing to Washington, at least in terms of an electoral college vote. When he got reelected for his presidential election, he was reelected almost unanimously, with one person choosing to vote John Quincy Adams. Some people debate whether that was for, just because they wanted to keep Washington as the only president who was unanimously nominated. I would probably think that, at least politically speaking, there's some people that just didn't like James Monroe, and it is what it is. James Monroe is also, in a lot of ways, the end of an era. And what I mean by that is, depending on your interpretation of who and what constitutes a founding father, at least to me, James Monroe is the last founding father that would be an actual president. I don't consider John Quincy Adams a part of that, if only because I think you need to have a gross influence within the actual Revolutionary War to a point where you basically are dictating policy in a lot of ways in terms of like the Continental Congress, etc., etc. I mean, fighting is one thing, but I also think you have to be part of like the Constitutional Convention, and you have to really it's hard to explain, but I don't consider John Quincy Adams to be a part of that. I consider John Quincy Adams to be this weird bridge between what I would say is the Founding Fathers and then this era of pre-Civil War, first generation, first generation Americans who have basically lived and been born under the moniker of democracy and independence and freedom, and it's nothing against John Quincy Adams. He was a kid. James Monroe actually fought in the war and almost died. And some people might even say Andrew Jackson, but Andrew Jackson was a kid, and let's be honest, he actually technically did fight in the war, and this is a very complicated story when I actually get to Jackson. But he didn't really do much after that. He was just a regular participant, and just because you're a participant doesn't mean you are the actual founding fathers. And it's much more of an ideological base too. I don't think John Quincy Adams was a very ideological person at that particular point in time when he was 14 years old. He could have been, I don't know. I can't read his mind specifically. I can only interpret what people have written for the most part. But what I mean, though, is the last founding father. It's truly just the end of an era, I guess you could say. The founding fathers really started when the Revolutionary War really began, and their era, for the most part, really ends when John Quincy Adams, in a lot of ways, becomes president. Quincy Adams is kind of this bridge between the founding father era with Madison and I guess a lot of people would say the Jacksonian era, the era of what I would say is the beginning of what would become our current constitutional democracy, in many aspects, in many ways. And it's kind of sad to think about sometimes, because in a lot of ways, I don't know if there's any other president that I think could really end that particular era other than James Monroe. A fascinating human being and a very fascinating person who embodies a lot of the actual things that we do know about James Monroe, at least in terms of, liberty, freedom, etc., etc., etc. And when I mean that he is the closest thing to, George Washington, it's kind of true in a lot of ways, in a lot of instances, although a lot of people would probably not agree with me in that statement and sentiment, because Washington's on a whole nother plane of existence, and I would kind of agree with that, but there's really no one that really comes close to George Washington in terms of at least the total package. James Monroe is probably the closest thing to it, a war veteran, a war hero, one that also has political savvy and political influence and pull, and is a driven politician, and one that, even though there's partisan politics, he's one of the very few that ultimately would actually bridge the gap for the most part. And then by the time he becomes president, it's known as the era of good feelings, where it's the middle ground between, Federalist ideas and Democratic Republican ideas. And while the country was economically struggling during the Panic of 1819, James Monroe oversees the only period in this country's history where there's truly no partisan politics, because partisan politics is dead during his term as president. And I think that's really fascinating, and really the way that one should end the era of the Founding Fathers before the era of modern politics really begins in a lot of instances, in a lot of ways. The more I look at Monroe, the more I look at a very fascinating individual, human being in person. I mean, he's so old school. He's so personable. Not personable, but he's very independent. He's very, traditional in many aspects, in many ways. There's actually a whole bunch of stories of, like, even when he was president, he was one of the very few people that were still wearing, like, the whole stockings and the powdered wigs and stuff, and, the clothing from way back when. Everyone's dressing in a much more comfortable getup and in a proper, more, I guess you could say, modern attire. He really is the last founding father. And it's really sad in a lot of... I mean, don't get me wrong, Madison would be the one to outlive him, unfortunately. Monroe would die about 5 years earlier. But at least in politics itself, he is the last founding father. And I don't know, I tend to think about that, and I tend to think about it in a much more melancholy kind of way. Things end. Life ends at some point, and, history, every single interpersonal relationship, every single event, every single rule at some point has a, relatively speaking, an ending. And the founding fathers, had changed the world for the most part. They changed this country, and they brought us freedom. And when James Monroe is president, it's basically only a handful of them left for the most part. And I don't know. I tend to think about this, and then I kind of just get sad sometimes, because then I reflect on the history that they were able to achieve, all the things that they were able to do. And it's all culminated perfectly in many aspects in James Monroe's presidency, which I find really fascinating. And there's really no other figure that I think really encapsulates the founding fathers than James Monroe. That's probably what I'm trying to explain and say. Because there really isn't. He's an original individual, kind of, at the very least. Not ideologically speaking, but personality-wise, he's fascinating. He's a character in itself, a driven man, a self-made man in a lot of ways. James Monroe is our 5th president and the last founding father. So, where do we begin, guys? Let's start with his childhood. James Monroe was born on April 28th, 1758 in the Westmoreland County of Virginia. He's the son of Spence Monroe and Elizabeth Monroe. They're both really loving and, for the most part, affectionate parents. And let me just get this out here. Not a lot is really known about James Monroe's childhood, at least very specifically. I mean, there's some writings that will detail, the little tidbits and whatnot. But for the most part, a lot of it's just conjecture, and, depends on the writing that you look at. I would probably assume that he had a modest childhood. I mean, he grew up modest. His father was a carpenter and just a farmer for the most part. And he would also do tobacco, diversify the crop fields, yada, 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 yada. But for the most part, just a normal, regular, childhood. Probably going to, go hunting on occasion and just eat some squirrels and shit, But, just a normal kid for the most part. And it's really not known, the specific reasons why. I mean, a lot of it really is just lost. There's no specific rhyme or reason for it. He just doesn't write about it in a lot of ways, or at least a lot of the writings don't really are supported from it, and not a lot of writings from others as well. And I would probably say specifically the early upbringing of his family life too. When he becomes more of a teenager, it's much more documented in detail. But I mean, like, for instance, his mother's death isn't really specified accurately. It's literally between 1772 to 1774. We can't functionally confirm when his mother died for the most part. We do know certain aspects and certain things that he has revealed throughout his entire life, and for the most part that other people have really explained. His father was a good farmer and a good father and a good parent, and one that was relatively I guess you could say relatively active for the most part. Politically speaking, he was aware of what was going on, and his uncle, what was his uncle's name? Joseph Jones, was a judge. He was a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, and he got to have friendships with like George Washington and other notable figures around that particular time in Virginia. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, all the other, Patrick Henry, all those guys for the most part. So he's very aware of the political machine and the political game at that particular point when he's young. We do know that he was first educated by his mother. I'd probably say he would be the oldest of 5, and actually later go to school on occasion. He'd take he basically take up a couple of long walks for the most part, and to go to school for the most part. Woodline walks to, I believe it was called Parson Campbell School. It was a small academy, and he actually attended that school with slightly older, but for the most part, future Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall. It's actually really fascinating, and they would actually room together, or I guess you could say tent together, during one of the winter encampments during the actual Revolutionary War together, when they would both serve. If he wasn't educated by his mother, she was educated, then he would go to school. But soon after going to school, for the most part, after he was relatively successful, he would have the normal, kind of childhood. But then his dad comes along, and he's like, "Hey, Jimmy James, can you come and help your daddy and do the whole farming thing?" And James is like, "Dad, I'm gonna go to school." And James is like, his dad's like, "Come on, you want to eat? You gotta eat. So you gotta help with." What I'm trying to say is James basically ended up leaving school early to help support the family and become a farmer, and really focused a lot of his time there. And he actually kind of enjoyed playing with the slaves. His family did have a couple slaves, and I think there are some stories of him maybe playing with the kids. I might be getting that confused. Another founding father and another particular individual, but he basically dropped out, and when he was about 14 years old. I think John Marshall was probably about 16, 17. He's a couple years older, for the most part. Well, we do know some things, though. Like, he was just a regular young lad back then. A lot of Virginian kids, and he loved to horseback ride. He loved to hunt, He was a big writer, surprisingly, and really liked to write some stories, and read a lot of philosophy as well. A lot of philosophy with a lot of these founding fathers. Also loved fishing and Latin, and a lot of them, do a lot of shit like that. And he played with other kids, and I think he actually did play with a lot of the slave children during the summer days, And he hated the British, and just like his father, because roughly around this particular time, what is he, about 7 when the Stamp Act actually happens and occurs, it's really interesting. God, he's so young. Like, it's crazy to think about, historically speaking. The Stamp Act occurs, and Washington's just like, and all the British and all the American colonists and the founding fathers are like, "Oh, huzzah!" But James Monroe is just a 7-year-old kid, and he's like, "What the fuck's going on? Fuck yeah!" Calling cookies, biscuits. Y'all are crazy right now. Okay. Anyways, he had a normal childhood for the most part until he was about 14 years old, and then things start changing for him. He loved liberty, and I would argue he was a very conscientious person when he was growing up, and I think that's what makes him a very fascinating founding father. He grew up with this idea of liberty to begin with. Like James Madison would kind of like get it for the most part, and he was more driven by just doing what's right and whatnot, but like actual liberty, actual freedom, and actual, like, imagine a 7-year-old just being like, like, it'd be like a 7-year-old today being like, death is a preferable alternative to communism kind of thing, like, it's just straight up, and he grew up, is what I'm trying to say, at a very young age for the most part, and unfortunately, he actually would have to grow up. Once he was generally working, his family gets sick, a lot of it. His mother dies, like I said, around 72 to 74. We don't really know the specifics of when she dies, but she dies when James Monroe is a teenager, relatively speaking, by the time he's 14 to 16 years old. It's really sad, okay? And then unfortunately, his father gets really sick, really sick. And Monroe and James himself his brothers take care of him while he ends up taking and tending the farm for the most part. And his father's basically just like, I'm sorry, son, I failed you. And James is like, damn it, daddy, damn it, you weak, because I'm James Monroe, son. And Spence, his father's just like, that's kind of cold-blooded. Blech. And then he dies. God, what year did he die? I want to say 1774, but for the most part, he dies also pretty young. And James immediately becomes the head of the household for his siblings, his brothers and sisters. His sister, at this point, I believe, is only a couple years younger than him, and I think she's already married. At that point, Monroe's 16. I think his sister might be 15 or 14 years old. Very young back then. So he actually works on the farm, and it's really interesting. A lot of things, things happen for a reason. And I think with James Monroe, things kind of just happen for a reason. I think he was very much content just being a normal farmer and ready to just, live his life and support his family the way that he's supposed to. And then his uncle gets word of his father, or technically the uncle's brother's death, and effectively comes and offers young James, and they were really close for the most part, and the uncle's name was Joseph Jones. He's a big prominent Virginia legislature individual, and he basically just says, I'll take over your state, go to school, and then when you come back, you can run this bitch, you know what I'm saying? And James is like, yeet, son, I'm gonna go to school, and I'm gonna get an education and be a proper civilized individual, yeah. Sorry if I'm being weird. Anyways, James decides that since he's going to basically have the opportunity to go to school, and go to school he wants to and does. He actually applies and gets accepted immediately, enrolling in the College of William and Mary in 1774 at the age of 16. Like, the moment that his uncle comes, he's like, I got you, son. He's just like, yeah, and then just goes straight for school. A lot of events are transpiring all at once in this particular time. Remember, it's 1774. The entire Boston Tea Party had just occurred, First Continental Congress. Like, Lexington and Concord is going to happen a year later, okay? And James Monroe really just wants to go to school, learn, but he also has this very liberty-minded individual. So when he leaves Westmoreland County, goes to, I believe, Williamsburg, and really sees a vibrant, kind of patriotic town, liberty-minded, and James fucking loves it. He's enjoying himself, fam, and it's an incredible experience for young James. And when he goes to school, he's learning a lot. The philosophies, everything, languages, everything that you can think of, mathematics, arithmetic, etc., etc. And, when he got there, he enjoyed college. Williamsburg at that point was the capital of Virginia at the time, and it was one of the big cities, and a lot of people had a lot of anti-British sentiment there. And he actually got to see protests not only on just, the outside in the streets of Williamsburg, but on his own campus itself, and patriotic fervors running really, really rampant along the entire colonies, And every colony varied in terms of their patriotic fervor, If you look at, like, Massachusetts, they're like the fucking ground zero for patriotic fervor. And there's real big pockets of Virginia, for the most part, in terms of their direct opposition to the British. But it depends, too, because, like, there's some towns in South Carolina, for instance, that were really anti-British, like, aggressively so, to a point where it's kind of fascinating to really look at and think about. This was a very testy time. James would basically go to his classes and try to focus on studying, but, you're a young student, you're a young person, you want to protest, you want to fight against the system for the most part. Even back then, the system was British, though, for the most part. And it's really interesting that, it's fascinating to think about, because protesting has always been a part of basically basically just the world, and it's been a part of this country's history from the very, very beginning. Which is why I'll always protect your right to protest, because this country was founded on protesting for the most part, at least at least technically speaking. James Monroe is one of these young, college kids who ends up basically after class going to protest, participating in a lot of patriot causes that'll effectively really just change the way this country and the state's going to run. There's one incident close to the time of the start of the actual Revolutionary War. I forgot what year it was. It might have been 1775. The governor of Virginia, this man, this loyalist governor named Dunmore, is a very prominent individual. He's not a very popular individual. Prominent, but not popular. And he's been trying to enforce a lot of the actual restrictions and laws after the Boston Tea Party, and because once the Boston Tea Party happens and the First Continental Congress gives their ultimatums and stuff what they want, Britain just tightens down, and Dunmore's one of these people that's forced to tighten down, and it's a little bit unfortunate because he doesn't want to do it. For first and foremost, he's going to get killed because it's Virginia and it's the colonial times, and number two, he just doesn't have that much power, that much leeway in Williamsburg. And despite him thinking about basically being, a patriot or a loyalist for the most part and doing what's right for king and country, etc., he ends up deciding, you know what, I'm just gonna sneak through the back, okay? Because these intolerable acts are getting really, really fucking ridiculous right now. So basically, they end up. A lot of the people, and a lot of the town people, and a lot of the citizenry end up basically storming the governor's mansion at one point. Monroe actually joins in on this. He and a couple of classmates are like, dude, they got a shit ton of guns in there. And Monroe's basically just like, oh, they do? We should probably steal them, right? Like, oh, no, that's wrong, man. Monroe's like, no, we're just going to borrow them. And then we're going to go give them to people to kill people in red coats, specifically. And they're like, you're making a lot of sense right now. Okay, cool. So basically, Monroe leads a small faction. You could say this is his first military task and whatnot. They storm the governor's palace or their home for the most part, and they go into like this little shed thing or in the house itself and get a shit ton of munitions, like I don't know, like 1,500 bullets, like 200 muskets, like 100 and something insane amount of swords. And immediately they go out to the actual local militiamen at the pubs, all the places, and we're like, anyone want a free gun? And everyone's just like, fuck yeah, okay, we'll take it. And then the local militia just basically got armed for the most part after that, and you can thank James Monroe for that genuine act of charity. So, after that particular event, Monroe, despite being this liberty-minded individual, and let me make it very clear, and I actually watched The Patriot, the film with Mel Gibson and Heath Ledger. And I actually think it's a surprisingly pretty accurate movie. I mean, obviously there's a whole bunch of things that get overly dramatized and dialogue and whatnot, but I think the tone, there's a lot of young men who are very fervent, revolutionaries, and Heath Ledger's character being one of these particular individuals. And I actually think James Monroe is kind of like Heath Ledger in a lot of ways, shape, and form. I think it's really fascinating in how I personally look at him. I really can't look at anyone else other than Heath Ledger in The Patriot when I think of James Monroe. Because he's in school right now, and he's really trying to focus his education while the war has started. It is going on. And he basically is seeing all this happen in front of him, and a lot of some friends who have joined the war cause. Some die, unfortunately, and it sucks. It's tough when you lose friends, and you're basically just trying to do the right thing to support your family, But he made a choice and he made a decision, because once he graduates and does whatever he's supposed to do and start his trade, then he's gonna actually make money and support his family. But he studies. He studies hard. He studies hard for a year and a half, both at school, just doing regular stuff, and a random law practice just to look at law books and try and study for the law and be a lawyer. A year and a half passes while he's in college, And at this point, it is a year into the war itself. It's about late 1776 for the most part, or mid 1776. I apologize. After the Battle of Lexington and Concord, Monroe makes a very bold decision. He's basically thinking to himself, sounds bad, but he's probably thinking, YOLO, okay? I only live once. I want glory in my life, like a lot of these young people who want to join the war effort and to try and basically become someone, and I want to fight for something that I believe in. Monroe makes the decision that he's going to drop out of college, support the war effort, wishing to fight the British and for freedom, and effectively joins the Continental Army. So James Monroe joins the Virginia Infantry, specifically the 3rd Regiment. He's actually assigned as a lieutenant, mainly because, for 2 reasons. One, because he's a relatively prominent, I guess you could. He's got somewhat of a name for basically stealing some muskets and shit, but also because at that time too, if you were a very cognitively articulate individual and could read, you're going to be bumped up a couple ranks, unfortunately. And a lot of people really couldn't, at the very least, the ones who joined the war effort. And he would actually join George Washington and his men on the march towards New York. When basically Washington and Philadelphia, the Virginia regiment that he would join, would meet them in Philadelphia and then go to New York for effectively the several battles and losses that would occur soon after. He would join his contingent of men for the most part. And I don't believe he was actually there. No, I take it back. I'm losing my train of thought. So Monroe would arrive and join Washington in the very successive battles of the Battle of Long Island, I believe the Battle of White Plains, and just all these several fucking losses that Monroe would effectively be a part of. Because he wasn't an officer, but he was basically kind of in charge, relatively speaking, of a specific regiment. And he would cross the Delaware on the other side to join Washington around late 1776, where Washington makes that very brave, notable ballsy move known as the crossing of the Delaware. That would be the battles of Trenton and Princeton. The successive battles of Trenton and Princeton. And Monroe basically is one of the soldiers that joins them, where the famous painting is depicted as Monroe, although Monroe was, for the most part, I believe, confirmed on a different boat. He just happened to be on one of the boats on Washington's troop group that, for the most part, reaches, and one of the very few that actually reaches. The others are basically either just, oh my god, it's too cold, and then, or they go back because a couple boats, they just can't do it, or they sink and then they probably freeze to death in the river. Some real fucking harsh times back then. Like, seriously, it's kind of fascinating. It's frustrating too, probably, if you're Washington. You're losing men left and right. So Washington and his men would cross the Delaware, and Monroe is one of the soldiers that's specifically leading a small little garrison to do all this stuff. And Monroe's a pretty chill dude at this point. He's a very fascinating individual, personally. I'll just explain it briefly because, most people would probably say, he's probably one of the nicest, genuine people you're bound to meet for the most part. Relatively honorable. Thomas Jefferson even said that, there's not a single spot on his soul for the most part. I'm paraphrasing here, but, most people when they meet him don't have at all any issues or problems with Monroe. Even Hamilton didn't really have any problems or issues with Monroe, at least until after the whole Reynolds affair thing, and Hamilton just accused him of that, in which case that relationship was, for the most part, over. But, Monroe found out about all that stuff and hid it, so, Monroe was a pretty, relatively speaking, honorable individual and a fair person, I would probably say. And him being a relatively solid leader and a really brave person too. I don't know if he was a fatalist or not, like Washington, but I'm not gonna be shocked if he didn't fear death in any way, shape, and form. So they cross the Delaware, and this is a very fascinating story because on the march to surprise the Hessians, who are basically getting all liquored up and trying to squeeze some titties and stuff, they go up to they go through this town, and They're making a little bit of racket, which they're trying not to because they don't want to alert the Hessian group of soldiers and whatnot. But a couple people come out and they're kind of like, who the fuck are you guys, you know? And one of them is a doctor. He doesn't announce himself as a doctor. He's basically just saying, who the fuck are you guys? You all British? And James Monroe's like, dude, like, I'm wearing a blue coat, like. And the guy's like, oh, okay. And I'm a doctor. And then Monroe's like, are you sure you're a doctor? You know, it's a bad joke. Anyways, they have a conversation for the most part, and Monroe kind of asks him to join them in case someone gets hurt for the most part. Fate works in mysterious ways. Really does. Anyways, the doctor agrees, and they end up going, and he joins them on the actual march to the fort itself. And you have to remember that surprise attack is a surprise attack. They basically catch the Hessians off guard, and it is a fucking insane capture KD ratio, whatever you want to call it, in relative comparison to what the Hessians do to the American Continental Army. There are very few casualties on the American side in this decisive victory, and very few people that are really hurt. The very few, unfortunately, is James Monroe. Because you see, James Monroe is basically in front. He's leading this charge against the cannon fire, whatever, the artillery fire. And he's fucking brave as shit. I mean, everyone was really impressed by James Monroe and his bravery and his strength and his character to basically just deal with that and then just march forward, you know, guns a-blazing. Unfortunately, while leading them, he gets shot. He gets shot, I believe, through the chest at an angle that when it pierces his chest, it also pierces his shoulder. He ends up severing an artery, unfortunately. And if you don't know your medical science, for the most part, if people draw your blood, it's going to be through your veins. It's not going to be through your arteries. Arteries are the actual blood flow and blood channel that goes to your heart. So it's going to actually be really, really, I guess you could say, bloody at that point. If you have a severed artery, it's going to be excessively high pressured blood that's going to spew out, and you're more likely to die and be susceptible. If you sever a vein, it's really not that big of a deal in relative comparison to an artery. But if you sever an artery, your blood's going to be just spewing out of you profusely, and you're going to die really quickly to just excessive amounts of blood loss. And you know, once that happened to James Monroe, he's basically shot, and he's slowly dying. And the person that saves him is the doctor. And the doctor's probably just like, hey, bruh, you good? And Monroe's like, because, you know, he's in pain. And the doctor's like, well, that was a probably stupid question by me. So he puts pressure on it and is able to basically take out. I don't know if he takes it out. I think the bullet might still be there I don't know, but I'm not gonna be shocked if it was or not. Anyways, he was able to stop the bleeding and is able to basically let Monroe heal. And it takes some time for Monroe to really heal, like a really long time. Well, not really long time, but at least a couple months. And he's really out of commission for this time. Fate works in mysterious ways as a crossroads. Just imagine if Monroe did not bring that doctor there. It's a great what if in this country's history. Monroe, after the Battle of Trenton, would basically kind of just be like in his camp, just like, oh man, this motherfucker is brave as shit. You know, like everyone gives him accommodations. You know, guys like Hamilton, Washington, they all basically are just like, you're my boy, man, you my boy. All his generals give him accommodations, and we're basically just, you know, Monroe's got a bit of a name now, at the very least in this camp, for the most part. And he's recovering around this particular time. They had basically fixed his issues for the most part. They had patched up and sewed up the artery. Or not, I don't even know if they sewed it up at that point. I don't know how you would basically do that. You basically just stop the bleeding, and the scar that would basically be there with him for the rest of his life. So Monroe ends up recovering. He ends up recovering for quite a long time at this camp, and he just wants to go back to fighting. You know, he just wants to keep fighting and serving within the military itself, and just fighting for independence. And you know, this is kind of his mindset, and it's good it's kind of good and a bad thing for Monroe at times, because he can kind of just be narrow-minded when he believes in something. which can be a good thing and a really bad thing, because, you want to talk about someone who devotes so much effort into things. It's Monroe. I mean, when I tell you about the stories of Monroe, basically during the War of 1812, it's fascinating how he's even able to function after that, let alone like survive. Anyways, he ends up recovering, and everyone's wishing him good luck and stuff, and that and two things you have to understand, and this is really, I probably touched on this very briefly with Washington. The war was very difficult for a lot of people, and if you were an actual patriot, you were going to be fighting in this war, and if you were an actual patriot, you were going to pay for this war for yourself, which is why a lot of people, really didn't want to believe in this thing, because first off, it's you're going against a superpower, and then second off, you're paying for your own way to fight and potentially die in this war. So, logically speaking, the fact that we had as many people fight in this war as we did, I think, is fascinating and interesting in my perspective and point of view. And a lot of people really did actually have to pay their way through the war. James Monroe is one of these particular individuals and one of these particular people, and he was financially backing himself with his uncle, Joseph Jones, who's trying to send him as much money as he possibly can without, having the farm just go under for the most part, and leave his family in a bit of a pickle. And his family was at this point a little bit concerned, because it's James. He got shot. We don't want him to die. He's kind of leading of the family at this point. But they understood, and I think they were going to be in good hands regardless of Joseph Jones, regardless of whatever the particular situation is. I don't, and they were all gonna be supportive because his family's not pro-British. I'll put it to you that way. So they're probably thinking to themselves, I'd rather you not fight, but if you're gonna fight, you better fucking kill some redcoats, motherfucker. You know what I'm saying? It says his brothers and sisters. Anyways, this is also a very interesting time because, well, a lot of things happen. First and foremost, this is where he starts meeting a lot of people, and while it sucks that he's not able to financially support himself as much as he wants to, because, at this point he's basically just relaxing. He's not fighting in the war, and he's basically just, I'm paying for all this stuff and I'm doing nothing. I'm not participating in the actual fighting itself. I might as well just go back to school for the most part. And he contemplated that for a brief moment before he basically just said, I don't care how long it takes. I'm just gonna I don't care. I want to get this cast off of me or get this shoulder sling off of me. And he ends up basically just, fuck it, I'm going back to the front lines. And when he does, I guess you could say recover, he rejoins the fight, and he joins the fight specifically with General William Alexander. This is actually the first time he meets Marquis de Lafayette around this particular point in time. Marquis de Lafayette, for him, is a incredibly deep and a lifelong friend, like a genuine lifelong friend. And Lafayette would keep many lifelong friends with, like, Hamilton. He was he was basically like a son to Washington, and for Monroe, this ended up becoming a very close friendship and bond as well. I find that's a very fascinating figure. Anyways, under General William Alexander, who was under Washington, but like one of the sub-commands specifically, because he used to be under the specific command of Washington, Monroe would basically, for the next couple of years, fight. He tried to get a commission as an officer using his name and stuff, and a lot of people were kind of like, look, man, you're pretty brave, okay, but you're kind of stupid, and like, it's not because you're intelligent, but you kind of just went straight forward into chaos and bullets and somehow just got lucky. And Monroe's like, well, I'm going to be eventually a pretty shrewd military leader in the future, so why not give me a chance? And then, like, nah, son, nah. Anyways, over this particular time, he ends up basically being in the military for another couple years, and he joins all the battles that Washington really is fighting in. Brandywine, etc., Monmouth, all the big battles in that particular point in time. And this is also where he ends up being reunited with a now young adult John Marshall, who also served in a number of notable battles as well. Monmouth, Brandywine, Germantown. That's the other one I'm thinking of. He would actually bunk with Marshall in the encampment, I believe, after Valley Forge specifically. So, even though he was a leader, and even though technically speaking he was kind of an officer, but he wanted to be an officer, and actually lead like a specific regiment, and that's pretty big back then. But it was very difficult to get a lot of those positions, a lot of politics, personal biases, and Washington was a much more merit-based individual. But aside from his bravery, it was difficult for Monroe to get it in comparison to a lot of the other people there, unfortunately, in order to get that officer position. Monroe's probably like, yo, Washington, what the fuck, man? Washington's like, hey, I'm trying to do this shit. And you're going to cry like a baby? And then Monroe's like, no, I'm not. I don't know. He didn't really cry like a baby. It was tough. And it was really frustrating for Monroe because, like I said before, he's paying for a lot of this stuff. He wanted to lead a group of men into battle again. But he would always be outranked. And what were the reasons? Well, he was young. I mean, at this point, he literally ended the war. He's like 21 years old at this particular point in time. And, that with the fact that he's also broke, coinciding with the fact that, his family just really can't support him all that much. And he's basically going to be forced to leave the war soon after. Coinciding with him being broke and, obviously the army not being well supplied. So he ends up leaving the actual war effort before the end in 1779, I believe. And it's really difficult for him to leave. It's a very big moment because he really wanted to just keep fighting for the war for independence, and really wanted to believe in this and was really worried. A lot of people were worried back then. We weren't going to win this war. Why keep doing the things that we're doing? And, Monroe, will say what you will, was a fundamental believer in independence and the belief of liberty. And Monroe fought like hell. He was brave. And in fairness, he's a fantastic tactician, as I will kind of explain a little bit when we get to the War of 1812. So, what does Monroe do? Monroe, for like the next 3 years, does a lot of things. And I genuinely mean a lot of things. First and foremost, he goes home. He wants to basically farm. He goes to farm for a little bit, make sure the family's estate's good, make some money, and he's really trying to up the finances so he can first go back to school and complete his education that he was really shirking off of. And, he was a pretty solid, diverse, he was a solid farmer. I would probably say. Did a lot of things: whiskey, wheat, tobacco, all that stuff. And he'd be just a really good farmer. Make a lot of money for the most part. It'd be very lucrative. And around this time too, like, he's still trying to figure out what the hell he's going to be doing with the rest of his life, like a lot of these young lads who, after fighting in the war, thinking what you're going to be believing in, etc., you're just kind of lost at this particular point in time. I'm not saying Monroe was going to be a general or anything, but I'm not going to be surprised if he had aspirations, at least in that particular direction. Monroe, once he goes home to the farm, and he's trying to basically get things back to up, back up to speed, make some money for the family. He still wants to fight, so he ends up joining the Virginia State Militia in defense of Virginia, and he has I don't want to say he has a reputation, but I mean, he's kind of like a hero still, the hero of Trenton, that famous battle, etc., the guy who got shot and survived, and word starts spreading around about the young upstart Monroe around 1779 then to 1780. And one particular individual that hears about this is a young governor at this point, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson basically has Monroe, for the most part, being a part of the actual Virginia militia. They meet and they're like, hey, yo, what's up? And then Monroe's like, what's up? And then they're kind of like, yo, you vibing me? And then Monroe's like, hey, I'm vibing you, dog. And they're like, all right, cool. Yeah, let's do this together. So they basically meet, build this camaraderie together, and and he becomes, like, in a lot of ways, like, Monroe becomes like Jefferson's spy in a lot of ways, in the very least a scout. He ends up being the person that in the defensive militia defends the governor for the most part. He basically is like sending messages left and right, giving Jefferson the heads up on potential attacks that are going to be coming on to him and the actual Parliament themselves. And it actually works for the most part for pretty well for the next couple years. Although at one point the Parliament would get captured, but Jefferson and his wife, who's just constantly sick and pregnant, would eventually escape from for the most part. Once the war is over, because Monroe does this for quite some time, and he's basically just trying to do all that he can for the most part before he actually really goes back to school, or goes to some form of schooling. He ends up really building this bond and strong connection to Thomas Jefferson, and kind of just like a wink like I got you fam kind of thing with Jefferson. He's still part of the Virginia State Militia. He's trying to get people to enlist into the Continental Army, to his beautiful benefit, because they need as many men as they can at this point. They're just trying they're trying, and they believe that the war is almost over, so he's just pushing for it. And once the war once that was over, sorry, I misread what I wrote down. Once that was over, when he's basically helping Jefferson do all that stuff, he's basically trying to help people for the most part, get people a part of the actual war effort themselves, and he does that for a little bit. And then once that ends for the most part, then he goes back to school. He goes back to William and Mary soon after, in about 1781 to 1782. Mainly with a lot of his uncle's help. His uncle, Joseph Jones, ends up being really the big financial background. The farmers at this point doing pretty well. And once he goes back to Williamsburg, it just so happens that in Williamsburg there's a young governor named Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson, after that, would basically retire from the governorship. It's for complicated reasons, but ultimately he just coward for the most part. A lot of people call him that. And James Monroe, basically in Williamsburg, is like, hey man, you wanna be my teacher? And he's like, yo, I got you, dog. So he basically takes all of Thomas Jefferson's books and starts studying them, and they really build a bond and friendship here. It's really strong, pretty good. And I just want to make a small point that by the time 1783 occurs, James Monroe is the last founding father president to have served in the actual war, actually serving in the infantry for the most part. And I would say, I believe, if I'm correct, the second to last founding father to actually fight in the war itself. The last one, I believe, being John Marshall, when John Marshall dies in 1733 or 1734, around that particular time and era. This is basically kind of a new start. Once he starts studying law under Jefferson, things are absolutely looking up for the young James Monroe. So Monroe studies the law. Okay, he's doing all this stuff with Jefferson. He really doesn't have a real keen interest in it. He's much more of a farmer, soldier. He's more of a politician than anything else, than an actual lawyer. One of the few founding fathers that were lawyers that didn't really have an interest in it, but he studies hard. He's a hard worker, insanely driven and competitive. I mean, when you look at what he's done during the War of 1812, I mean, it's he's pushed himself to the limit at that point. But ultimately he ends up he passes the bar in 1782 and gets into the Virginia Assembly with Thomas Jefferson, who is really helping him a little bit at this point. This would be around the time when Jefferson's worst year of his life effectively happens to him, unfortunately, when his wife dies. But part of the Virginia Assembly, he's just working on a lot of little state stuff, council of the state, to push a whole bunch of different measures that'll basically help with internal improvements, etc., etc. And because he's a states' rights individual, James Monroe is. He's very keenly states' rights individual. Anyways, while doing that for a year, he sees an opening, because the war at this point is over. And it's been over for a while, and a lot of people really aren't doing much for the most part, since basically for the most part, like peace, I guess you could say, was relatively achieved, since no one had been fighting for the last year and a half. Once the war is officially over, The Continental Congress under the Articles of Confederation had an opening. So James Monroe thinking to himself, man, the federal government sounds pretty legit. Doesn't have a lot of power, but you know what? It can give me a lot of influence, give me a lot of sway, you know what I'm saying? And what the hell, I'll run. So he ends up deciding to run with his influence again with Jefferson and other notable figures around that particular time. He gets elected into the actual Continental Congress. For 3 years, he serves the Continental Congress, or the Congress, Confederation Congress, whatever you want to call it. And for the most part, he's kind of just doing his own thing. And I mean, his time there is just really, I don't want to say pointless is the wrong word. Because I mean, most of the actual point of the Continental Confederation Congress was really kind of pointless because they couldn't really do anything. They were basically just legislating for nothing, and the states really couldn't. The states were going to do whatever the hell they wanted for the most part. And Monroe was just like, okay, cool. And he was a very states' rights advocate and big advocate of like westward expansion, manifest destiny. That would be really keen. And I believe James K. Polk, specifically in his term in his presidency. So I think that'd be really fascinating and interesting. His time there is really just about making connections. It's about meeting people. And it's about, maybe increasing your sum of money and wealth overall. He really builds his profile for the most part at this particular point in time. He's meeting everybody. Patrick Henry, most notably James Madison, would really befriend him in particular, especially since Madison and Monroe are kind of like, oh, wait, hey, you're James Madison. Yeah, Jefferson talked about you. Oh, nice. He said something. Well, he said you're small, Madison, and Madison's like, well, fuck you. And then Monroe's like, my bad. He's just telling the truth, man. Like, you're not a big person. He's like, it's a sore spot, okay? And, little things along those lines. For 3 years, he's a part of this legislative body and doesn't really do much other than the occasional going to Congress and whatnot. He's really just working on his farm, working on his plantation, acquiring more lands, and trying to be as business-like, capitalistic, I guess you can want to say, an entrepreneur as much as he possibly can. And it would have mixed results, I think it's fair to say. It's a little bit complicated with his finances, but I'll go, into that much later. So the capital is in New York City, for the most part at this time. And in New York City, they would have to go to the meetings with the actual Congress and whatnot. And they would stay at a whole bunch of different boarding houses with some people and whatnot. And, they would have these frequented, normal spots that they go to. And Monroe was no different. Every time he'd go to New York, he'd be enjoying the sights, the sounds of the city of New York City. And in one particular congressional hearing and meeting that he was joining, he goes to the meeting and he actually sees a very beautiful woman. Her name is Elizabeth Courtright. He is immediately smitten with. Elizabeth Courtright comes from a relatively prominent merchant family. She's the daughter of a merchant, and the two would immediately fall smitten with one another. Their marriage is very fascinating. They would marry in 1786 and have a couple of kids together. I'm just going to briefly describe their relationship. It's not a great love story by any stretch of the imagination, but a good partnership. And out of all the founding fathers' marriages, I would probably say, I don't want to say the least affectionate, but it's very fascinating. A lot of it had to do with basically her being a reserved person and him being a reserved person as well. They're both just really reserved people in general for the most part, but Monroe especially, doesn't really, he's not the most affectionate individual. And like, when you read some of their correspondence, it's not like the most filled lovey-dovey things like, say, with Abigail and John Adams and whatnot. It's pretty straightforward. Like, I care about you, dutifully full life, or dutiful wife and stuff, But it's also probably one of the stronger partnerships, I would probably say. And don't get me wrong, they would have their problems exactly just like with any other married couple, especially around that particular time in that era. But what I mean by stronger partnerships, like, when they go to Europe, she basically risks, a lot of stuff in order to help free a close family friend, and she's very kick-ass in that way, shape, and form. And always a deeply supportive wife, although she would unfortunately be really plagued with health problems after like 4 or 5 kids, or however many kids they had. I think only 3. No, 3. They only had 3. 2 daughters and 1 son. The son never survived, unfortunately. The marriage is interesting. Just 2 people who deeply loved each other, and Madison or Monroe being such a big, strong, honorable Virginian, the personality differences between them weren't as stark as a lot of people would probably say. But anyways, they had a pretty good marriage for the most part. And effectively, once the 2 of them get married, Monroe's basically thinking, what am I going to do? Because I got my wife pregnant, we're going to have babies, and I got to make some money. I got to do all this stuff. So effectively, he leaves Congress so that he can actually, make money and do work. And a lot of people would do this during like, it's because it's being in Congress and being a part of the whole political body. It's not very financially lucrative. I mean, a lot of people would leave. Hamilton would leave the Secretary of the Treasuryship just so that he can go and make some money, because this is before everyone finds out about the Reynolds affair. So it is what it is. So Monroe, he moves his family to Fredericksburg, Virginia. It's a much more open city for him to basically open up his own law practice, which he effectively does quickly. It's around 86, 87, around this particular point. The country's in a very weird spot, So he moves his family there, his wife, and now I think at this point his first daughter, ironically named Eliza, after his mother. It must be strange household. Eliza, and they both answer, and James is like, "What the hell's the matter with you, Eliza?" And then they both be like, "What the hell's the matter with both of us?" And then it's just a never-ending cycle of comedy at that point. The country's in a bit of a panic, not financially. I mean, obviously financially, but for the most part, culturally, ideologically, government. There's nothing there. There's no structure. People are kind of just losing their minds over the differences between the states and the federal government, the powers that be. And, Shays' rebellions was like a really big, breaking moment that really shook a lot of people into basically thinking, you know what, we should probably, ratify a new constitution and whatnot. James Monroe is chilling at this point. He's enjoying life. He's doing his thing. He's just making money. And he's doing pretty well for the most part in terms of financially supporting his family. But, then he gets word and he starts seeing some of the things that are going on. And he's a little bit influenced by Patrick Henry and a couple of the people who would be considered anti-federalist for the most part. And, Monroe sees the faults in the government and the Articles of Confederation, but he's also kind of the person that if you have to choose between states' rights and the federal government, he's always going to choose states' rights. He's a Virginian. He's a lifelong Virginian, although he believes in America and the United States of America specifically. It's a little bit unfortunate, in my personal view, because his congressional record's a little bit... Because he votes against the Constitution for the ratification. But I'll explain that just a quick second. So he hears about all this, the ratification of a new constitution that's happening, the Constitutional Convention, and around 1787, 1788, he decides, you know what, I'm gonna go back in. I'm gonna join the Virginia legislature and figure out, like, can I maybe swing or functionally understand what the fuck is going on right now? Because, you have to understand, like, when they did the Constitutional Convention, like, it was like a really closed-door event kind of thing. I believe Benjamin Franklin once said that, if the Constitution was open to the public, it would have never been ratified. So, basically, he effectively goes back into the actual Virginia state legislature. He runs again and effectively gets in. And it just so happens that it coincides with the time that Virginia's effectively going to be, ratifying the Constitution or not. And, it's Washington and Madison in the pro-ratification party, and then it's Patrick Henry and whoever else, a lot of people in the anti-federalist party for the most part. And then you got people like, Monroe kind of just in the middle, and they're just basically chilling for the most part. And the whole point of these ratifications and all these debates for the most part was trying to get the people that were in the middle that didn't know whether they were actually anti-federalists, federalists, or if they were, let's just try this new form of government. A lot of people were really apprehensive to the idea, and Monroe being one of these, moderate individuals, although I would say he's far more leaning towards an anti-federalist federalist perspective. So how does Monroe view this? He is a moderate, generally speaking, and he would vote against it, which would effectively make him an anti-federalist. But he wasn't wholeheartedly against it. He actually understood Madison's perspective and point of view and actually kind of agreed with them, although he understood why a lot of people didn't like it. And he was a fundamentally a big advocate of the actual Bill of Rights themselves. So, which is funny because despite getting all the guarantees of the Bill of Rights and stuff, he still votes against it. I find it really interesting that he did that still. Anyways, soon after, Virginia would, despite his opposition to it, Virginia would vote to ratify the Constitution soon after. That's big. Virginia being like one of those states. It'd be like if, I don't know, Great Britain first joined the EU. It'd be... Sounds bad now thinking about it with Brexit, but sorry, didn't mean to bring that up. If you're listening to this and you're British, in which case, why the fuck are you listening to this? Good luck to you. Anyways, once the actual federal government became established, once a whole bunch of different things happened, and the actual federal government was actually established, and the Constitution, first came the elections to elect your specific representatives. Now, the first Continental Congress, or the first Congress, I guess you could say, with the first House of Representatives, first Senate, etc., etc., etc. Madison and Monroe both were kind of eyeing a little bit the same seat, the same House seat, and so once Congress was elected, basically they're fighting each other for that particular seat. And this is where we'll kind of begin, where they would become frenemies. They're always pretty strong, pretty close to each other, but at this particular point, it's kind of like, hey, yo, bro, you want that chair? It's like, well, yeah, I kind of want that chair. They're like, well, no, it's my chair. No, it's my chair, man. No, it's my chair. My chair. And unfortunately, Madison would win out because he's much more popular, much more... the guy wrote the damn Constitution, so if anyone's going to interpret it in a particular way, it's probably going to be him. So, unfortunately, because of some... You can argue some, like, political finicking and stuff, because people are trying to get people elected, not elected. It's all politics. It's all stupid. Patrick Henry's trying to get him Madison out of the office, but then other people are trying to help him get in. It's a whole complicated game. Regardless, Monroe basically just loses the opportunity, and seeing no opportunity for him, at least politically, to get back into the game, he just decides, you know what, I want to be a lawyer again. So he returns to his law practice. So as a lawyer, I couldn't really find anything specific about James Monroe's court cases for the most part. He didn't really take anything that was specifically notable. I don't even think he really cared about being a lawyer for the most part. So I think he was just an average lawyer. He was more proficient as a farmer, as a landowner at the very least. Could really diversify his crop yields and whatnot. He was just a good farmer. So during this particular time, he's kind of just relaxing. He's waiting. He's basically spent the last 3 or 4 years really fighting in Congress on and off while taking care of the farm and doing a whole bunch of different things. And it's really, really interesting because for him, it's kind of just a waiting game a little bit. Because at this particular point in time, there's a bunch of the old guard founding fathers who took a lot of the House seats, the Senate seats, and one of them's looking pretty old. In particular, it's this one Virginia Senator, William Grayson. And it sounds bad, but he kind of sees he's just waiting for an opening at this point. Someone's gonna die or someone's gonna leave, and the next spot he gets, he's gonna try and take, because being a part of the Senate and actually being a part of the legislation, plus also being friends with Jefferson. And I'm pretty sure he's probably saying hey man, if I'm gonna be the Secretary of State, you gotta really get in there. I need as many allies as I possibly can. And Grayson would die soon after in 1790, and his spot and seat would be opened up. So they would have a contingent election, and then Monroe is basically like, "Hey, Jefferson, Madison, can you guys hook the brother up real quick?" Well, it's not really them hooking him up. He hasn't enough notoriety and reputation as a particular individual to really do it on his own. But, it probably helped, politically speaking, to be a part of that. And to, have the people in that particular area, who were all Democratic Republicans for the most part, support him. And he was like a fervent Democratic Republican. A lot of people call him like a radical in a lot of ways. And I'll explain that in a little bit. So, he wins. And he wins, and specifically, he wins a Senate seat. That seat that was lost was a Senate seat, and he ends up becoming quite literally the youngest member of Congress in the first actual meeting of Congress. At this point, too, we have to understand that Madison and Monroe, they would have a very lifelong, complicated relationship, friendship, frenemies, enemies, allies. They were the best of friends when Monroe and Madison were basically going at each other trying to get the House of Representatives seat. But for the most part, there's two things that united them, in which they would eventually really become solid friends for the next, effectively like the next decade and a half for the most part, 2 decades. One, their support and friendships with Jefferson, trying to make things work with that and support him so that, at least in their view, the Federalists don't go too fucking crazy. And number 2, they both hate Patrick Henry. They really just don't like Patrick Henry. Even though Monroe voted on the side of Patrick Henry, they really just, they detest him. Because of this, they really become friends and really unite, with Monroe being in the Senate and Madison being in the House. So, this is, I guess you could say, the beginnings of the Democratic Republican Party. Depends on how you look at it, your perspective of it. For the most part, while Monroe's in the Senate, he is just fervently with the Democratic Republicans. He's voting for against every single Federalist measure, and they would have the minority in the House, and I believe the Senate, at least in the first 2 actual congressional elections, whatever you want to call it, first 2 Congresses. And, they were the respective leaders, like I said before, Madison in the House, Monroe in the actual Senate. And for the most part, his Senate records will link basically just the general opposition to every single Federalist policy and laws, And this is around the time, too, that Monroe really wants to do more. Like, he's just a kind of a go-getter individual. And that you can argue that this is partially because, of bias or whatnot. And I guess you could say he wanted to dig up dirt, and I don't think he wanted to dig up dirt. I just think he wanted to do, he wanted to make sure specifically that the Federalists weren't doing anything real sneaky around this particular point in time. So he's a part of certain committees and whatnot that are really looking to basically extort and get rid of corruption. You can argue for political reasons, and I would actually probably agree it is for political reasons. But, he starts looking into the Federalists and trying to expose their relative corruption, because he thinks they're corrupt, obviously, because the Federalists around that point, they're back and forth between corrupt and generally okay people. So, this is where the jumpstart of the Reynolds affair really begins with Hamilton. So around this point, 1793, 1794, basically in Congress, he's just a staunch Democratic Republican leading the opposition against the Federalists. And the whole story is that, Monroe is basically looking at financial discrepancies, and he's like, why is Hamilton paying off? Oh, this seems like a bribe. Oh my God, I gotta confront Hamilton. It's him and a couple other people specifically. They actually go to Hamilton's house, and there's a whole bunch of different interpretations of what effectively happens. But for the most part, they just go in, and Monroe and the people were kind of just like, so why are you bribing these particular people? And then Hamilton's kind of just like, fuck, because Hamilton's just a truth teller, to be honest with you. He just says like it is, and he's like, look, man, I hooked up with this lady, found out she's married, and now they're extorting and blackmailing me. And they're all kind of just like, oh, and I personally don't think Monroe did anything to expose it. I would just think it's just blind incompetence that a lot of the stuff happened. And Monroe, in fact, he gave his word. He's like, look, man, there's one thing for political stuff like this, but I don't want to ruin your reputation just because, you made a mistake like this, And don't get me wrong, Monroe's probably thinking at the same time, like, I will keep this in my back pocket just in case. So, then he finishes the report. He sends it to somebody who just so happens to maybe be in close proximity to Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson might get a hold of it, and then he might give it to someone who's he might be sitting on the story itself, and then he might give it to someone who eventually will disseminate into newspapers and make it a scandal, in which case things will hit the fan. That's generally the story in a really long-winded way of effectively what happened. So, soon after that, Monroe's basically taking all the sides of the Democratic-Republican policies and whatnot, including, the difference between siding with France and siding with Britain, and he sides with France, and he's a big advocate of France. The only other person that loves France more is Thomas Jefferson. And, and Washington needs someone with good eyes and ears, and he's looking at Monroe, for instance, and he trusts Monroe. He's brave, he's strong, they fought well for him. So he asked Monroe, hey, you can speak French, right? And he's like, voulez-vous français? And I'm like, and George Washington's like, well, fuck you, because I don't speak French. And it's a big, funny joke for historians, because him not speaking French is probably a big reason why the whole French and Indian War started, and technically speaking, you could say the Revolutionary War started. Anyways, for the most part, Washington asked him if he would be willing to be the minister and ambassador to France. And, Monroe's basically like, well, fuck it. Okay, yeah, let's do this fucking, and immediately resigns his Senate seat and makes the trip and journey to France. And he becomes the minister that would basically be, his time would be fascinating there, and I will explain it in just a second. You have to understand the differences between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, because the main reason is the Democratic Republicans during Washington's presidency loved the French people, liberty and all that stuff, and they hated Great Britain. They were very antagonistic towards them, and for the most part, Britain was the financial lucrative option for the Federalists, and they were the ones that the Federalists were really eyeing, at the very least, because it's just smart money at that particular point, even though, in fairness, they're going to be overstepping a lot of their boundaries. So, in fairness, Monroe was a big, staunch believer in France, and he got the opportunity to actually go to France and be the ambassador there. So, the year is 1794. He had spent the last, however many years, 4 years being a senator, and, he just was a normal Democratic Republican, just voted along party lines for the most part. And he gets the opportunity to go to France, etc., etc. So what is France like at this particular point? Well, it's in revolution, okay? He's basically in the thick of the French Revolution by the time he arrives there. And it's a very, very interesting time, I guess you could say. American and French relations were kind of just strained. France is going batshit crazy. They're doing a whole bunch of random shit. They're fighting a whole bunch of different wars with a whole bunch of different people. They're winning, they're losing. Nothing makes sense during the French Revolution, and I want to do a specific deep dive episode on that, because the more you look into it, the more you're kind of just like, I'll put it to you this way: if people are concerned about what's happening in today with all the social justice stuff and people trying to change everything for the most part, we'll understand that during the French Revolution, they literally changed the calendar to effectively a 3-week month, 10-day week, and changed a whole bunch of different shit, created their own religions and whatnot, because they didn't want to go into the whole Christianity thing, or, things are fascinating when you really look at it, and history has a tendency to repeat itself, although in various different ways. So, he joins and arrives in France during effectively the thick of the French Revolution. It's very fascinating. I would probably say, in a lot of ways, in fairness, I think he's actually pretty solid as a diplomat, and kind of just a victim of circumstance when he's forced to leave. And I'll explain that in a little bit. But when he arrives there, a lot of people love him. He has this great reputation. Lafayette's basically like, hey, this guy Monroe is fighting. He fought in America. He's this great guy. And he meets Lafayette, and he's like, hey, man, what's going on? And Lafayette's like, yeah, I'm probably in trouble. They don't think they like me. I think they're trying to imprison me and stuff. They definitely took my wife in prison. And then Monroe's like, oh, no. And then Monroe's wife, Eliza's like, I'm on it. So she basically does a whole bunch of espionage shit, low-key espionage shit, to free Marquise de Lafayette's wife. And then they basically give her like a fake passport out of the country. I think they go to like the Dutch Republic, but they get her out of the country, and it's really fascinating, that story. Anyways, Monroe's particular time here is supposed to fix relations, supposed to stop, the rising tensions, because before the British start doing their crazy stuff, French are starting to go a little bit antagonistic, and they're starting to increase their starting to increase tensions and starting to overstep their boundaries. This is like the prelude eventually to what would be the quasi-war, for lesser words, I guess you could say. Also, a lot of things too. Like, he gets to meet a lot of different people. Thomas Paine's actually, I believe he's here at this point. He ended up leaving America because he was being persecuted and chased by the British. So then he goes to France, and then I think he ends up meeting him and staying with him for Paine for a little bit, or Paine stays with him for a little bit during this particular time. It depends on how you look at it, because Monroe's is supposed to be improving relations for the most part, but Monroe's just enjoying the sights and sounds of France and Paris in particular. And while, Paris didn't have the Eiffel Tower, et cetera, and they're kind of full-blown guillotining everybody left and right, and it is what it is, unfortunately, where, like, the better part of 40,000 people would lose their lives, Monroe's kind of enjoying himself a little bit, the arts, the style, etc., the liberty, freedom, etc. And, I think he tried to do his job. He tried to be a fair, diplomat for the most part. But politics, unfortunately, just didn't look good. That one of Washington's diplomats was basically out there commingling with the French in a very, not conducive way to help the United States and the country. So a lot of people didn't like that. And in fairness, he really wasn't doing his job, I guess you could say, on a technical level. He wasn't a neutral party, unfortunately, despite all this, and his family, Eliza, both Elizas, and his other daughter, I forgot what her name was, I believe might have been there at this point. I don't know if she was back in America at this point, born yet, but she was they're all chilling. Okay, they're all chilling, they're all not really it's like a vacation almost to Monroe, unfortunately, and this would effectively end up leading him to be recalled in 1796, and this is a bit of a tough time for Monroe, really, really tough, and because he really enjoyed France despite people dying, losing their lives, and the whole French Revolution going on, and he'd be kind of leaving by the tail end of it, because he ended up being up in the heart of it. When you actually hear some of the stories of the French Revolution, people were just fighting each other. There's a story of Marie Antoinette's, I forgot, it was a princess person who was effectively one of her best made people, and did a whole bunch of stuff for the family, et cetera. And she ends up basically getting beaten and her heart torn out at one point. Unfortunately, I don't think she survived. But it was pretty fucking gnarly, I guess what I'm trying to say is the French Revolution was chaotic, and despite Monroe, disliking the chaos, I think he just got lost in the French liberty fervor. He's a ultimate freedom-thinking, liberty-minded individual. He's kind of like Reagan in a lot of ways, where Reagan's just full-blown, America could do no harm, and liberty and patriotism and freedom of the individual, so much so that you almost embody that entire spirit, for better or worse. I think it's for the better for at least Reagan and his sake. So he gets recalled back, and he gets recalled back at a very difficult time, because first off, it's an election year. the very, very first election in 1796. And it just so happens that Thomas Jefferson's there, and hey man, I'm welcome back. I'm trying to be the fucking president, man. It's pretty fucking wicked, isn't it? Against Madison, who was the vice president, and a lot of stuff happens, I would say, within a 2 to 3 year span, from when he comes back, for the most part, in 1796. So when he does come back, he's being basically attacked in a lot of ways politically, unfortunately. The election itself was a really complicated election, but he's kind of being ringed a little bit. He's a little bit embarrassed, the fact that he got recalled for being biased. It's fucking dishonor for him specifically, especially for if you're a Virginian and you're this disinterested person, like the character of Washington, for instance. It's really embarrassing. I'll just put it that way, put it lightly. So a lot of stuff happens during this particular time. He basically just tries to go back to work as a lawyer, but it is also around this time that the tabloids, they're starting to get a little bit rambunctious. All these accusations are being thrown around, and around this time too, the political attacks start happening during the election, and one of them ends up the Hamilton Reynolds affair ends up being actually exposed around this particular time. And Hamilton gets upset, finds Monroe, and confronts him. I forgot what year it was. It might have been 99, 98, or 98, around that particular point in time. Might have been earlier. But for the most part, it was after Hamilton resigns from the Treasury, and Monroe comes back. So I'm probably going to guess it's around 1796. But for the most part, the actual accusations come out. Hamilton blames him. Monroe is basically pleading his innocence. He's like, I don't know what you were talking about, you son of a bitch, yada yada. And Hamilton's like, draw your guns, and dueling's hella illegal. It's been hella illegal for the most part in most of the states, and everyone just does it on the hush hush. And Hamilton is just like, I love Hamilton, but a lot of people, they get butthurt about a lot of things back then. People say we have thin skin now, but if someone insulted your mother back then, they'd be like, I challenge you to a duel for recompense for my mother. And it's just like, okay, it's a joke. Don't take it seriously. Anyways, I'm just pointing something out that I tend to understand about duels and a lot of people back then, But Hamilton's trying to regain his honor and whatnot, and wants to get back at Monroe in a lot of instances. And their friendships, whatever friendship they had, is effectively ruined at this point. And Monroe, not being a wussy, not being a bitch, ends up basically saying, "All right, my guns are ready. Get yours ready." And they're about to fucking duel. And this would be one of the great showdowns of all time if this duel actually took place. But ironically, Aaron Burr. History is fascinating, that Aaron Burr basically steps in between the two of them and is basically saying, you guys are fucking idiots. What are you guys doing? Stop all this. You don't have to kill each other, okay? And effectively they end the duel. Calmer heads prevail, because you have to understand that I'm pretty sure Hamilton would have killed Monroe and vice versa. This is a very tricky moment in the history of these two individuals' lives. So Monroe basically just goes home, and he's still embarrassed. A lot of people are kind of just, he has a negative reputation for his time in France for the most part. So negative, in fact, that he actually ends up writing a series of essays, and that gets disseminated in newspapers that he sends out, just trying to justify his particular time in France and the conduct that he had for the most part. And just to explain his actions and as he returned to normal life. This is also, first off, there's a lot of reasons why he did this. First off, he wanted to clear his name, wanted to be free of all the political haberdashery, whatever you want to call it. And it's really testiness within politics at this point, because the political attacks between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, they're getting real fucking fierce. They're just going back at each other, trying to fight for power for the most part. And, at the same time, too, he never really forgave Washington. which was really difficult because Washington would eventually die, along with Hamilton several years after. So, Monroe's at this. This is a bit of a crossroads on what I would say for Monroe, because I think he's willing to just retire. Because after he got to travel. He got to see France, got to see Europe, and he's getting attacked left and right. His family's dealing with it. His wife's not too happy. He's not too happy, and at this point, his finances could be a little bit better. Let's just be honest about that. And he's really just ready to retire. I would probably say around this particular time he's probably about 40, 50-ish, probably closing in on about in his 40s at this point. I'm really bad with ages at this juncture. No, okay, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. He's probably about in his 40s or closing in on his 40s at this particular point in time. Might as well just retire. But then comes Jefferson and Madison. They need more support in Congress. They need more support as much as they're willing to get, whether it's in Congress, whether it's any form of government position. They just need all the guys that they can get, all the allies they can get. It's all about politics. It's about getting people with some name recognition, for better or worse, into positions of relative power. And Monroe, basically, they ask him to return to Congress. And Monroe's basically like, nah, I ain't going back to that. I ain't doing that. If I do something, it's going to be state politics. I'll just rejoin the state legislature. And they kind of compromise in a lot of ways. And effectively, they basically say, look, come back, run for governor. And Monroe's going, I don't know. Government really doesn't have any power. Okay, but at the very least, you'll be in some form of position of power. You get paid, yada, yada. And he's like, fine. I'll do anything for you, Jeffy Poo, So James Monroe becomes the new governor of Virginia, and he would serve from 1799 to 1802. Monroe takes over as governor of Virginia in 1799. More or less, politics and political parties are kind of just established, whether or not people realize it at this particular point, and they all see him aligning. They all see Monroe, aligning and siding with Jefferson, in kind of a radical Democratic Republican in a lot of ways. And, a lot of people like that, especially in Virginia, because, like, states' rights, and, he's a Southerner, so, a lot of things like that. The governorships do not have power, that's just the unfortunate truth and reality. Most of the rich aristocratic people preferred it that way, and things wouldn't change until, several decades later. But for the most part, it wasn't going to stop Monroe for at least attempting and trying to push policies that would continue along the lines of Jeffersonian ideals, which he vehemently believed in. Public education, freedom of religion, a whole bunch of different things, even some internal improvements that are state legislated and okayed. His time during the governorship really is just, he doesn't get a lot of things done. He's just overseeing, for the most part, just the basic everyday activities of the actual state itself. It really isn't until he leaves that things really start picking up. The only notable thing is a year in 1800 is known as Gabriel's Rebellion actually occurs. For those of you who don't know, Gabriel's Rebellion is when slaves took over on a plantation and basically started just killing all the white people for the most part. And the slaves just basically had an uprising. And they basically go to Monroe, and Monroe's like, what the fuck y'all doing? And then, long story short, Monroe was forced to, unfortunately, to basically just execute all the slaves and kill all the people, to make sure that the actual slave uprising doesn't really spread any further than necessary. And although he did at times apparently he did actually, at least I read somewhere, that he actually tried to help free or banish some of those that had participated in the actual brutal killings of their slave owners, just so that they would survive. Mainly doing it, it was rising tensions of slavery. This is around this, you want to talk about the slavery issue. It's always been a problem, and it doesn't start. And it doesn't start with like the Missouri Compromise. It starts well before this, tensions are rising. The cotton gin has been, invented and implemented about close to a decade ago at this point. Cotton's really big, and Virginia and all the other southern states are basically really big producers of all this cotton, unfortunately. And it sucks because a lot of people will probably say Monroe was probably a shitty governor for doing that, but it's like, what do you do? I mean, you're gonna piss off somebody, and you're gonna end up looking, evil in one way, shape, or another, which is, it's tough to be the boss sometimes, or at least be in charge, because you just get all the blame, and it's hard to look at it from an empathetic point of view, if you're so hell-bent on saying that's particularly evil without understanding the full context of it all. And it's unfortunate for Monroe, because his history on slavery isn't grand. He's one of the other, like Jefferson and Madison, that would own slaves, although he probably treated his slaves just as up to around the level of Thomas Jefferson, at the very least, in terms of just being good owner. Well, in fairness, it's not the greatest owner. When he's there, he's awesome. When he's not there, the caretakers of the actual lands themselves will probably treat the slaves poorly, So, at the very least, he's indifferent to slavery. He doesn't like it because he's always a liberty-minded individual, but it is what it is. Call it hypocrisy if you want. He's probably one that it's very difficult to justify his slavery, if only just because of the fact that, like, he is Liberté, France, and fuck, like, this dude probably owned at least a couple dozen slaves, and really, when he's not there, doesn't take care of them as well as he probably should have. So if you're going to criticize anyone for slavery, it's probably going to be James Monroe for the most part. Anyways, Monroe, during this particular time, at the very least, his name really started reaching star-level potential, because despite him not really accomplishing a lot, he's becoming a popular figure within the party, especially when Thomas Jefferson wins the presidency in 1800 and 1801. And he's basically really rising within the party itself. I mean, to a point where, like, him being the Virginia governor along with the Virginian president, okay, it's looking like there's a connection there, And other than maybe Madison being the Secretary of State, it's looking like Monroe's, like, third in line to eventually become president, And it's unfortunate, too, because it's when the attacks really start coming back for Monroe, because, Jefferson's a Democrat-Republican, and elections are really fucking fierce, and a lot of people don't like these people, so they start attacking, Madison, Monroe, and all these people, and Monroe's basically like, why are they attacking me? And they keep calling him a French nationalist and a traitor of his country, and Monroe's just like, what the fuck, man? Like, y'all rude, y'all mean, homie, like, y'all gotta break my heart like that. Anyways, he effectively serves his third and final term in 1802, and again, for like the 15th fucking time, James Monroe is very content and decides he's going to retire and do his law practice and focus fully on his plantation, at least for the rest of the year. So again, for a year, Monroe retires, he's relaxing, chilling, trying to make that money, and then yet again, when his president needed him most, he was there. Thomas Jefferson comes in, and he's basically like, hey man, shit's about to go down in Europe, and I kind of need you for a quick second. Do you think you can maybe do some negotiations and whatnot for this little deal that we got going on about 1802, 1803, around this particular time? And Monroe's like, okay, sure, I guess. So Jefferson sends Monroe to France to go with negotiations with Napoleon Bonaparte and his relative contemporaries and stuff. And he's basically arriving there, and he's like, oh, what's up, Singleton? How you doing? And Singleton's like, what are you talking about? Shut up, Monroe, okay? Because we're going to buy the Louisiana territory. And he's just like, what the fuck are you talking about? And then basically Monroe gets there as the purchase is kind of being, relatively speaking, finalized, or at least the details are being worked out for the most part, and the deal given. And Monroe's basically just there to make sure everything's signed, dotted the I's and dotted the T's, So Monroe's a part of the Louisiana Purchase, and interestingly enough, and a lot of history books will probably point to him being a big, crucial part of it. And history tends to overestimate his influence in that particular point. And I think he had some, at the very least, probably maybe plus or minus some dollar bills and whatnot, but for the most part, it's really Singleton's deal. So after that, I should probably point out the deal did not technically and specifically go into Florida, which is a big problem with the actual deal itself, which would lead to a lot of problems and a lot of territorial issues during the War of 1812 and the Florida Wars, etc., etc. And when Florida's trying to be a state later on, it's tough. It's very difficult, and would be a problem between America and Spain, and then just Spanish countries in general with America. So while over there, Jefferson's basically like, hey man, do you like it over there in Europe? And he's like, I guess. Can I just stay in France? He's like, oh no, we got an ambassador there. Hey, can you go to Europe or Great Britain? Because they're kind of doing a bunch of shady shit over there for the most part, and we don't like what's happening over there. And Monroe, he's just like, okay, fine, I guess I'll just go. And he decides, he agrees and becomes the ambassador to Great Britain immediately after. And as it's around 1803, 1804, around that particular time when he becomes the ambassador. So he goes and becomes the ambassador to Britain, and he's actually there negotiating a deal with Spain. Monroe purpose for his entire time was his entire purpose was there for being there in general. God, I sound dyslexic right now. His entire purpose there while being there was to basically just stop war from happening. Just stop the tensions that are rising, because there's a bunch of problems with Napoleon and Great Britain, and Spain at this point is kind of like a subsidiary colony, I guess you could say, or part of the French Empire. And I mean, the only people that aren't conquered is like Great Britain and Russia at this particular point, in Napoleon attempting to create his empire. And there's a lot of issues with rising tensions in America because Great Britain's trying to keep their stranglehold on the colonies in some way, shape, and form, with them influencing the Indians and tribes and whatnot, attacking settlers, and not to mention them just taking people, imprisonment, ships. 1804, 1805, a lot of them start happening because they need men to fight Napoleon, and it's really difficult, and it's just kind of becoming a real fucking problem for the most part. So Monroe spends basically a shit ton of time trying to negotiate a genuine treaty that ends up basically being positive for America, and all he was able to get were some concessions that would be known as the treaty, as the Monroe-Pinckney Treaty. It was a fascinating treaty, I guess you could say, in terms of like a treaty. It was a good start, I guess you could say, that would be leading towards better relations overall that would actually help, stop imprisonment for the most part. But Jefferson basically saw this, and, he's like, ugh, yikes, I wanted more from it. I think it was more of a political thing than anything else with Jefferson, which is the whole reason why he ended up not sending it to the Senate. And Monroe got really upset after years of negotiation that he did not get his treaty because he did not understand what Monroe was doing for the most part, and the whole purpose of the whole fucking treaty to begin with. So Monroe, during this time, he's just working hard, diligently, day and night, trying to hammer out details while trying to wait and get word from what's happening in Europe and America and all that, etc., etc., etc. So in 1807, around that particular time, Monroe would again, he just says, I'm done. It's too cold over here. I want to go back to my farm. I gotta make sure my slaves are Gucci. Okay, let's do this. Okay, I'm going home. So 1807, he comes home. And by the time he comes home, again, another election is coming. And he receives a brilliant, beautiful, warm welcome. And a lot of people really like James Monroe. And you're probably wondering why people like James Monroe. I would probably say two specific reasons. One, he's a radical Democratic Republican, so he'd basically just be not very a part of the whole machine or whatever. He's not gonna. He has shown, I guess you could say, a tendency to not be a particularly biased person. If he believes in something, he believes in something, and at the very least, politically speaking, most people would tend to agree with, that assessment around that particular time and era. And number two, which I think is the biggest problem for Madison, I would probably say, who's the initial front runner, is the fact that Monroe's overseas, so he's not going to be specifically blamed for a lot of the things that are happening during, Jefferson's presidency. The Embargo Act that he's doing, which made Monroe's life a living hell during Great Britain, and it made him seem much more sympathetic and empathetic in a lot of ways when it came to, like, Monroe didn't create a lot of the problems that are happening domestically during Jefferson's second term as president. So for the most part, he's looking pretty hot right now. He's looking pretty good. He's looking very strong as a potential candidate for the most part. And, although he has a strong candidacy, there was a strained relationship at that point between Jefferson, and Madison, because he just felt betrayed by all of them for the most part, and he was kind of just like indifferent to, any sort of anything really. I don't want to say that it was specifically like brokenhearted or not, they weren't friends anymore, but it was definitely strained, and it only made it worse when Madison basically really kind of forced the Democratic Republicans to choose him for the most part. Really taking away votes or potential votes away from James Monroe during the whole caucus thing that they were trying to do, because they wouldn't openly campaign to be president and whatnot, or any elected office. It was kind of really, why would you do that, And Madison and Monroe he cared. Don't get me wrong. He would love to have been president, but he wasn't actively going to do it. So he was kind of just like nudging people to at least throw my name in the ballot, And he got some. He got some votes for the most part. He would not campaign, but did not rule off the draft of he did not rule out getting drafted to be a potential candidate for president during the convention, and he comes in second for the most part. In comparison to Madison. And ironically, I would say probably the one thing that made him lose was probably because he was too radical, at the very least, in terms of trying to get votes. Because people in the South are probably thinking to themselves, like, man, you're kind of too states rightsy, or you might be a little bit hypocritical, or at least in Madison, you knew what you were going to get as a president for the most part. Or at the very least, a perception of presidency, because he's already been doing the damn job itself, And at the very least, he's a very active Secretary of State. Monroe's a bit of an enigma, so you don't really know what you're going to get. And Monroe hears about this, and he's like, man, Madison, y'all fucking suck, So he basically just stops talking to them. He effectively tries to quit for one last time the party, and he just leaves it all behind again, or at least attempts to, because that basically ruined and made it impossible for him to forgive Jefferson and Madison. It was a very difficult and tumultuous time for James Monroe around this particular a moment. He just felt betrayed, and he felt distant, and he ended up leaving. James Monroe would not talk to James Madison or Jefferson, I don't believe, for the next 3 years, and I think he was very much content with not talking to them for the rest of his life, if it called for that to happen. So, Monroe basically goes into retirement for the second to last time in this instance. He ends up it's around 1809 to 1811. James Monroe, full-blown coming to a realization that, he's going to be like 50 soon. He's going to be going into retirement age, and that, he really has to start thinking about his future and his family's future, because, life expectancy isn't that high. Even in that time, he's kind of old, to be honest with you. So he spends the next 3 years really building up his farm, building up his law practice, trying to be as lucrative as possible and profitable as possible. People who run the plantations didn't really effectively do their job, so he ends up just like hiring some new people. He's doing everything he can to keep tabs on the finances, or he's trying to do everything he can except keep tabs on the finances. Sorry, that's what I meant to say. He's just spending money left and right, trying to make things work. And it's one thing to throw money at a particular problem, but then you actually need to, balance a budget for the most part. And exhausted from politics, he's kind of just peaceful. He needs a break, and I think Monroe, for the most part, is one of the very few presidents that gets the most breaks, at least mentally speaking, and it allows him to be a much more competent, political leader for the most part, thankfully. And everyone leaves. Jefferson would get headaches. Madison left at one point. Even Adams numerous times tried to leave, and Washington always left. So let's just be honest and say that what, it is what it is. People leave the actual office itself for some form of political power, etc., because it's just in their best interest health wise. And it was, by the time Monroe basically is 1711, he's basically game, he's ready, in fact he really starts to miss it. So after several years, Monroe decides he's gonna run for the governorship again. He's like, I'm getting that political itch again, love, and I think we're finally in a much more stable financial situation, so let's just fucking go for it. And his wife's probably like, okay, fine, I'll be a hot governor's wife, etc. And then he easily wins in a landslide. You want to talk about notoriety and positivity. He wins the landslide in 1811. And just as he's about to start his governorship, James Madison is just like, hey, what's up, Monroe? What you doing? And he's like, I haven't talked to you in a while. It's like, yeah, it's been a while, so why are you being a butthole? I don't know, am I being a butthole? They would reconcile for the most part. He would send a letter because Madison needed a new Secretary of State, and he just basically said, you're my guy, Monroe. I need you, boy. I need you to do this for me. So James Monroe, he hesitates for a second. He's thinking about it, because he can just be a governor and have a normal, regular life and just enjoy himself, have an easy job for the most part, and make some money. Or you can do the hard job. You can do the hard thing, but you know what? You can get a lot of power. You can get a lot of influence. And you might just be president of the United States. And you know what? His parents did not raise no loser. James Monroe would effectively accept the nomination and fully get accepted by Congress, I believe, in the middle of 1811. And he would be the new Secretary of State under James Madison. So James Monroe becomes the Secretary of State for President James Madison. So what's happening during this point in time, okay? Well, the relations between Great Britain and America have only expediently gotten worse to a point where they're on the brink of war. So James Monroe's like, what the fuck, man, okay? But for the most part, even though the relations between Britain, France, and America are all over the place, he's trying for the most part to repair the relations along with James Madison. While, it's tough because while, both Great Britain and France were seizing ships, it was Great Britain who was seizing American soldiers or people and sailors to basically fight in the actual war against Napoleon during the whole Napoleonic Wars. Monroe initially was peace. He was always about peace. And it was very difficult around this particular time, too, because the war hawks were basically fervently on Monroe and everyone else, for the most part, to go to war, because this is just escalating to a point that there's no going back to. Monroe starts, hearing them out, and he actually starts understanding the perspective, and even he begins to agree, you know what? There's really no going back. And he ends up becoming a war hawk in a lot of ways once there's really no way to go back from where they're at right now. It's going to end in some form of conflict. So, most of Monroe's time as Secretary of State can functionally be attributed to effectively just the war effort itself. And I'll explain in just a second. So the war begins, and it's not good. America is clearly overconfident and fundamentally unprepared. They need a standing army, and all they have is militias, and they can't really build a navy. So they're basically playing the defensive game, and they're incredibly unorganized, which would lead to numerous people leaving the Secretary of War ship. Monroe actually would hold that spot dually for initially in like 1812, 1813 because he's trying to find a replacement. And he would take over the spots on 2 separate occasions. Little tidbit, being the only cabinet member in this country's history to hold 2 separate cabinet positions, Secretary of State and Secretary of War at the same time. And his initial run was good as the first time when he was Secretary of War, because he really pushed more efforts into make America competitive at the very least in terms of naval battles. And while Secretary of State, he was also basically he was basically as close as you can to be like a commander-in-chief as like George Washington, for instance. Like, he would actually go out, he would actually at certain points he's leading scouting parties during the Potomac March, and ultimately would stay when DC would be burnt out. That's just an example. It's much down the line, but like, he's basically out there fighting within the war effort itself and leading troops into, I don't want to say skirmishes, but potential skirmishes if things go south very quickly. So while he's basically Secretary of State, just doing his thing, leading all these parties and whatnot, the war is just at a stalemate for the most part. Other than the British really burning Washington, I would probably say America kind of had more of the overall well-known battle victories for the most part. And America's holding their own, but they're not winning, and it's a little bit stagnant, and people are complaining, okay? Not just the citizens, but like the soldiers. Everyone's having frustrations for the most part. And, Madison's basically like, dude, I gotta let this Armstrong guy go. And he's basically asking Monroe the biggest favor he's ever gonna ask him in his entire life. And it's basically, can you be the Secretary of War and the Secretary of State at the same time? And, Monroe's basically like, oof, hold my beer. And then, with the ineffectiveness during the war, Monroe took over and did everything. I mean everything. The stories of him actually basically getting a cot that he would never sleep in Washington, would work 7 days a week, never sleep, maybe get about 3 hours of sleep a night at best, and he's basically just constantly there working, signing off on papers, leading troops into specific positions, trying to force and create supply chains. He's trying to create another the second national bank to help finance the war, because the first one's charter ran out, which basically put a little bit of a dip in the economy, unfortunately. Monroe does like 3 things as a Secretary of War and Secretary of State dually that I think are important. One, he reinvigorates the troops, because he is a bit of a war hero, still a bit of a legend. And you know what? To see him doing the way that he is, fighting fervently in the way that he is, it's incredible. Number 2, he basically protects Washington, D.C. from another potential attack. Because you have to remember, they may have burned down Washington, but they're not going to burn it down again. Not under his watch. And number 3, they were able to build up enough, military, financial, and physical power that at the very least it was enough that the British, after, them defeating Napoleon and stuff like that, it was enough for the British to be like, okay, you know what, we'll start doing some peace treaty stuff. You know what I'm saying? It cannot be specifically... what he does is so fucking important. Whenever I do my episode of the War of 1812, he's just going to have his own section specifically for the specifics that he contributes to the actual war itself, and I think is really fucking important. And Monroe is basically like, do this, do that. I'm pantomiming the fact that he hasn't slept in like 3 weeks. He saves this war. Andrew Jackson really finishes off, but James Monroe gets us to the table where the Treaty of Ghent can be signed. The war made Monroe a national name. They saw him as this great leader that they haven't seen in a while. Some people even, I think, would actually compare him to like Washington. Not obviously in stature and capability and all that, but like reminded him of just like this great grand leader. And someone that could be the next commander-in-chief, And a lot of people were looking at him from that point on basically as the front-runner for the presidency. And more so than just the reality that he was the Secretary of State and looked like he was going to be the heir apparent to Madison for the most part. But the election was coming soon. Sorry, I'm short of breath for some reason. But the election was coming soon, and Monroe was the actual front-running candidate. So before the end of Madison's term, Monroe was the clear candidate, although people didn't want another Virginian president. Let's just be honest. There was 3 of them in a row, 4 in total out of the 5, and Virginia was going to be an overly represented presidency, and they wanted more diversity in a lot of their candidates. Notably, New York really wanted a lot of their candidates for the most part, and it was very, very difficult for a lot of these people, because if you look at like the political scenes back then, a lot of people really trying to raise a bunch of New York politics is deeply fascinating. So when I get into Van Buren, it's going to be kind of incredible, but them trying to get a whole bunch of other people into the actual political game itself to try and win the presidency up north, it's deeply fascinating. But New York was one that was kind of getting a little bit frustrated with the lack of representation, I guess you could say. Yeah, there's too many Virginians in this motherfucker, you know what I'm saying? Monroe solidifies what would effectively be his unanimous presidential win in a lot of ways. He's a big leading factor in what would be effectively the purchase of Florida. At least in Madison's term. He basically purchased Florida in 1815 for $5 million, which, a lot more land, a lot less contested of a area that they have to deal with, and it's a very important piece of property for the most part that this country is going to have. And now there's going to be no more tensions between Spain and America. The election of 1816. Let me make this very clear, because during this time too, Monroe and his entire family is basically, along with the Madisons for the most part, and a lot of the endeavors that they've been throughout the entirety of the war, and all of them are tired, and all of them want to go home. And Eliza, the wife, she's been very sickly, but she's still very supportive of her husband for the most part. So James Monroe did want to be president, but I think he was very cognizant of his family and his health for the most part too. He would eventually have some problems too by the end of his presidency, and things were, it could have been up in the air. Like maybe a unique what if moment, but a very small what if moment if, maybe he just decides he's just not going to do it because he's thinking about everything else other than, doing what's right for your country, etc., etc. Anyways, the election of 1816. There was no other candidate for the Republicans other than Monroe. They tried to put a couple other people. The only other person that probably would have even had a shot was Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson, he was fine. He wasn't going to do anything. He was just going to chill and be with his wife, Rachel, and just live his life for the most part. But he declined. And even then, I just don't think he would have won. I think Monroe had too much, going in his favor. Monroe would face Rufus King, who would be the last Federalist presidential nominee, as the Federalists going so anti-war during the War of 1812 really backfired to a point where they basically just had no support from that point on. The Federalists would effectively be gone by the next election, and all of them coalescing into the Democratic Republican Party, unfortunately. And the two-party system would effectively be gone, but that is getting way ahead of Monroe's presidency. So Monroe was apprehensive, but willing to run for president, and he becomes president in a landslide electoral and popular vote, one of the highest in this country's history. His electoral vote was 183 to 34. That's nothing to ring home about, but he won 66% of the fucking popular vote. It is unanimous as James Monroe officially becomes this country's 5th president. So, what is America like in James Monroe's presidency at the very beginning? Well, as I said before, the economy was improving, at least to a very, 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 very slight degree. In the initial beginnings of Monroe's presidency, a lot of that had to do with just the sheer reality that the banks were trying to open up. It was people were working again, and the war economy, I guess you could say, really hadn't caught up with them yet. And the eventual panic that I'll talk about in just a little bit, a lot of things are going to catch up to them that have not caught up to them. So things are improving, at least to a very slight degree, and enough for basically the Democratic Republicans to get a real big boost within the actual election itself. So when Monroe becomes president, it's really interesting. A lot of cool things are happening, or not a lot of cool things, but, like Harvard Law School, or Harvard actually opens up their section of law school, the first school of the deaf opens up in, is it Hartford, Connecticut, I believe. Little things like that. The potato famine in Ireland is occurring right around this particular point in time, in which case a lot of people in America are kind of like thinking #blessed that, we weren't like the Irish colonies for the most part, So Monroe becomes the 5th president, and his presidency is very interesting. Most people call it in the era of good feelings, and I'm going to go through the timeline specifically. I just wanted to point this out, that when I said that this is probably the most peaceful time in this country's history, although amid an economic depression with the Panic of 1819, so much stuff happens within Monroe's presidency that I don't think I can absolutely go super in-depth, deep dive into it. I mean, like just the Protestant Reformation basically within this country, or, just the religion getting a second awakening, whatever you want to call it, happening roughly around this particular time that'll very grossly influence religious ideals. You can argue those religious ideals, made the Quakers and put those people in specific ideological camps based off of their religious beliefs, and it's deeply fascinating, Monroe's presidency. There's it's not that a lot of stuff happens, but it's there's different things that happen that create different layers, and there's so many layers to his presidency. So before we actually go into the whole relative deep dive into the specific timeline of his entire presidency, let's start with his cabinet. It's also a little bit fascinating, and aside from the Secretary of the Navy and some positions leaving very early on, most of his cabinet was intact, with people that would influence, the next 20 to 30 years of, policy. I mean, first you have John Quincy Adams as a Secretary of State with a long history at this point, and I'll probably just detail his history more so in the next episode when we talk about John Quincy Adams. But by all accounts, and when you look at his entire, for the most part, his history as Secretary of State, he's probably the single most accomplished Secretary of State in this country's history. I mean, did a lot of things, and would do a lot of things that would basically make James Monroe look like a god-tier president for the most part. On top of that, second is William H. Crawford as Secretary of the Treasury, who I guess you could say he was kind of like the middleman between the Federalist and Republican ideals, and he would actually be a presidential candidate in the election of 1824. One of the 5 candidates. And then, of course, finally, John C. Calhoun as a Secretary of War, being a leading voice of the eventual Democratic Party. It'd be him, Jackson, Van Buren. I think that'd be the leading voices that would create effectively the Democratic Party. And I think a 1 or 2 time presidential nominee. I know he threw his hat in the ring in the election of 1828. So the ironic part about his presidency is that despite 8 years, he would only appoint 1 Supreme Court judge, known as Smith Thompson, who was his Secretary of the Navy, fascinating enough, even though during this time he would run for other public offices too, while also being a Supreme Court judge. So it's a little bit tricky, but his specific appointment doesn't really change much of what effectively happens. So, what does Monroe do? How does his presidency start? Well, it starts with the Rush-Bagot Agreement. See, Britain, their minister to the United States, Charles Bagot, agrees to what is known as this Rush-Bagot Agreement. Richard Rush, they basically, for the most part, agree on what effectively will be territorial, like, final lines, I guess you could say. I mean, I don't know how to really explain it. And not to mention that too, but getting rid of British ships in the Great Lakes and all that, and to limit the naval capacity on the Great Lakes itself. Possible tensions that could ignite into war yet again. And basically, the whole point is no war on the Great Lakes. That's basically what they effectively agree to with that little thing. So the first thing Monroe technically does himself is he actually goes on a tour of the country, which kind of sucks because, you should probably be doing your job as president. But you know what? He's going to take a victory lap. He did all this stuff, and he's going to take a 16-week tour of New England. And, and it's just fascinating. He meets all the people. He loves it, and this tour gives the designation, I guess you could say, that people started calling it, because of this tour, the era of good feelings. Because, a lot of people, for Monroe, a lot of people saw this as kind of just like interesting, like no more partisan politics. People were kind of just happy a little bit, and at the very least in the beginning, things are good. We're all chilling right now. Smoke a doobie, homie. Now Monroe comes back from really feeling himself for the most part, really enjoying just exploring the country. And he legislates, I would probably say, one of the most fair administrations. That's not really the right thing to say. Well, I mean, I guess he's this weird balance of Federalists and Democratic Republicans. He really learned from all of his predecessors, what really works. And it's to try and be as objective as humanly possible, regardless of what you believe in as a president. You're supposed to do what the people want for the most part. And he's really done that. And he's surrounded his entire cabinet is just the embodiment of it. I mean, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams is basically Federalist. And most of his policies kind of reflect this. I mean, he's a Democratic Republican states' rights person because, soon after the Missouri Compromise would occur. But at the very same time, he's keeping the national bank, at least for sure, keeping the charter for the next 21 years before it has to be renewed. He could technically fight it and get rid of it at any point in time. He has all the power in the world, and he chooses to keep it. And that's just James Monroe, And his presidency, for the most part, is an embodiment of this. It's a growing country. People are coming left and right. A lot of people immigrating from Europe for this land of opportunity. Within, one presidency, our population basically increases by about 25%. I think there's probably close to 10 million people at this point, by like 1820, and it's a reflection of that for the most part. Because we're still in the thick of the Industrial Revolution too, which should be noted. Increased textile factories that are basically the beginnings of a production line. Which is very important. I actually wanted to talk about the market revolution, and I think that's really deeply interesting, in the Industrial Revolution as well, because the real capitalistic functions of society are really full blown. Basically, from his presidency on, I would say they just go full bore for the most part, because we were slowly turning from the agrarian society, especially in the North, to a much more industrial, actual mercantile economy that's actually going to facilitate, really good trade, goods, products, and get away and basically, go into the future for the most part. The South would be really, really bitchy about it, but at the same time, they are still the backbone of our economy. I'd say about 60% of the economy around this particular point in time is still going to be, a contingent on the South, especially just with trade, just for, all the cotton that's going to be going to England for all their textile mills. It's very lucrative, and this would be a big contention because America's kind of slow initially with their industrial revolution and their technological advancements, and it would take them a while, and it'd be really until like after the Civil War when the second industrial revolution really occurs, where industry is really everything. So right now, it's a bit of a tricky time, at least economically. But what happens during Monroe's presidency? I got off on a bit of a tangent, because Monroe has truly one of the most peaceful presidencies you're bound to have, other than the eventual economic problems that I'm going to talk about in just a second. Nothing really happens specifically in America that's of contention. There's no real threats for the most part, and this is probably the most truly peaceful time in this country's history. No partisan politics, just people being people. So Monroe, for him, he's effectively just chilling. He's vibing. He's feeling himself, I mean, there is that lingering problem with Florida that's just been kind of nagging at him and nagging at a whole bunch of different people, but it comes up, I guess you could say. Nothing really happens, I guess you could say, for the first year and a half. The only thing that really does happen is Florida, and notably, the Seminole Indian attacks. What's happening in Florida right now is twofold. One, it's still contested territory in a lot of ways, in a lot of aspects from Louisiana Purchase. And number two, this is more of a Jackson thing, I feel like, than anything else. And I'm probably going to talk about this more in depth when I talk about Jackson. But for the most part, it's also just, the Indians are attacking the settlers that are nearby, and they're being, I guess, enticed by the Spanish and some British remnants, I would say, in some instances, because Jackson would effectively execute 2 British soldiers, so whatever your personal opinion is on that, it is what it is. Anyways, John C. Calhoun, his Secretary of War, ends up setting Andrew Jackson to quell these uprisings, to basically protect all the settlers and American citizens that are in that particular region. And they basically are just, he goes ham down there. Andrew Jackson would eventually be the first territorial governor of Florida. God, I am fucking dyslexic right now. Or not dyslexic, tongue-tied right now. Aside from that, Jackson basically almost creates a bit of an international crisis because he executes 2 British citizens and the rising tensions with Spain, but they kind of just abdicate. And Monroe's really mad because he's trying to have his presidency all chill and whatnot, and Jackson's just like, hey man, I'm vibing with myself down here, I'm gonna do what I want. And John Quincy Adams is like, hey man, Monroe, my boy, you gotta chill, gotta be cool, okay? Gotta relax, okay? And Monroe eventually relaxes because ultimately nothing would really come from this, despite disapproving greatly of Jackson's actions, I guess you could say. I mean, because he understands that Jackson's behavior was necessary because it's what they were doing in Florida would really account for a war, and he's basically saying at this particular point, when he finds out all the things that Jackson has been finding out, that he's just like, hey man, you know what, Jackson, I was mad at you at first, but you know what, I understand. Spain is losing control, and you know what, do what you gotta do there. Do what you gotta do. So Jackson does what Jackson does. He dominates, he rules, he ends up taking really a strong strategic position within Florida itself. And really at this point, Monroe realizes Jackson's put them in a really solid position for really negotiations. And Spain, I think partly because they understand and realize Spain, because the Latin American countries that Spain is basically the actual imperialistic leader, they're kind of revolting in a lot of ways. I mean, soon Mexico would declare their independence. A whole bunch of the other South American countries would declare their independence. I mean, basically the whole Monroe Doctrine that's going to be occurring really starts here, because I think he realizes this and realizes the actual influence that the European powers are having, and that they're kind of losing control, because in Europe around this particular point in time, there's a whole bunch of uprisings and revolutions and a whole bunch of other basically countries within, France, England kind of, but, I guess you could say liberty is ringing true against the monarchies in Europe. And it's very, 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 very apparent, and Europe would basically kind of all coalesce and be like, all the monarchies there would be like, hey man, you should probably unite and crush all this shit, right? Yeah, okay, cool. Pretty much everything, it's the beginning of the battles between, the liberal ideology versus the, I guess, monarchical ideology or the autocratic ideology. I mean, Britain would kind of create their own parliamentary system in response to this, but they're still kind of an imperialistic power. So, after this, Monroe is just chilling, okay? Excuse me. He just does his thing, okay? So from like 1817 to about 1819, ultimately all that really happens is, first and foremost, a shit ton of states end up becoming a part of the Union. Alabama, Illinois, I can't think of any of the others off the top of my head, but a lot of those end up becoming states. Just basically normal stuff is happening. People are just improving. The economy is improving. People's lives are improving, And unfortunately, it wouldn't all be Gucci, I guess. So two things really happen, and it really all begins around 1819, 1820, around this point. First and foremost, immediately in January 1st, literally 1819, I guess you could say the Panic of 1819 really begins. If you don't know what a panic is, or any of the panics, because if you look in your history book, it's basically just a whole bunch of different panics within the 19th century. It's a depression, I guess you could say. Well, it depends on how you look at it. It's both I guess you could say it's a minor depression and a relatively normal recession. Market forces, unfortunately, are very unstable around this particular time. And let me make it clear, it's not that the market itself is wrong or fucked up. The biggest problem is that, well, it's twofold. Well, okay, let me explain the Panic of 1819. The Panic of 1819 is an economic depression that would effectively last throughout Monroe's presidency. He really doesn't do a lot with it. He kind of just lets people do their thing, and in a lot of ways, he's kind of just thinking to himself, maybe this, because these things are little ebbs and flows, and it'll eventually correct itself. Although the biggest functional problem with this particular panic and this particular depression and recession is, I think it's about 3 or 4 things. First and foremost, the thing I kept alluding to is, they're kind of, the war is catching up to them. It kind of is at this particular point. Debts need to be paid. The country took out a shit ton of loans, and the people took out a shit ton of loans too that need to be actually paid and processed, unfortunately. And you need to start paying some of your debts. It's got to be minimum payments, and if you don't do it, then foreclosures are going to happen. You're going to lose your land, and it happened to a lot of people, unfortunately, because a lot of these people end up taking out loans to try and jumpstart businesses, and they really couldn't get those businesses off the ground. Number 2, I would probably say the biggest reason actually is Europe, and specifically in Great Britain. Great Britain fighting Napoleon and us really took a big financial toll out of them. They basically were just they're fighting 2 wars effectively at this point, losing a lot of men, and people are coming back to work, and the job market's not looking too good, and inflation's going up, and business is down despite being in the thick of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And, Britain, the main source of their cotton is and at this point now, the United States. So when they go under, we go under, unfortunately, and we aggressively feel the effects of their lack of economic purchasing, I guess. And number 3, I'm not an individual that's for controlling the market. It's more so at the very least nowadays, because I think we understand economics much better than we did back then, and I think we understand that economies back then versus now are very different. And back then, market control probably would have been a much more beneficial reality for a lot of these people, because I'll put it to you this way: a lot of people bought land speculation, land specky, and then a lot of this had to do with a lot of the territory in the West that was still being basically settled for the most part. Texas would be a part of this in the next decade or so, or next decade and a half or so. And then Illinois is becoming a state. A whole bunch of these places becoming states, and land speculation kind of just went rampant and wild as people were trying to make money. And, no one wants to buy land. No one wants to buy that land for a profit. And basically, a lot of people went broke because of that for the most part. I mean, a couple people. I mean, William Henry Harrison, I think, had a lot of problems with that too. And notable other founding fathers and other great historical figures would deal with problems of land speculation. It's unfortunate because the Panic of 1819 would really last throughout the rest of his presidency. And a lot of people really didn't blame him. I think a lot of people were cognizant of the reality, the situation, I mean, especially a farmer who's like, man, the British ain't buying my cotton, what the hell? It's kind of like in that mindset, I guess you could say, because everyone felt this, and every single country was dealing with the problems. And a big issue, too, was capitalism and industry for the most part. There's going to be real ebbs and flows, and it's driven by consumer participation, I guess you could say. And it was really tough because no one was really buying anything, which is why I think this is much more of really a recession than anything else that slowly kind of turned into a bit of a depression. Here in America specifically, in England, it would be much more of a depression than anything else, because they could not pay for it, and they didn't have enough jobs, or not enough people for enough jobs for the most part. So it was a little bit difficult for them. This would just be throughout the rest of his presidency. Monroe, in his entire first term, is essentially dealing with two things. One, all these states that are coming into the Union, and just day-to-day matters. And the states coming into the Union are going to be a bit of a problem. Alabama, Illinois, you got one northern state and one southern state. Then Missouri comes around, and debates start arguing whether Missouri is going to be a slave state or a free state, and the debates are very fierce. And let me explain what's happening and why this is very important, okay? Because it goes on this. The arguments and the debate between slavery and free and whatever, your interpretation of slavery and whatnot, that it is what it is. Understand that this is both an economic, political, and social issue that is happening within this country, and it really begins here without a hesitation. You can argue it starts in other points within this country's history, but without hesitation, that the actual gun that's going to fire, that's going to start this race, starts here. The divide really begins when the North basically just abolishes slavery in general and just outlaws slavery. Part of that too is because they're able to, because their economies are much more built on textiles and et cetera, et cetera. And the truth is that I would say, economically speaking, you can blame the cotton gin for slavery in the South, and it's not the fact that, I'll put it to you this way. The amount of people that it took to labor-induce cotton and a whole bunch of different, products and whatnot, plants, et cetera, and crops, it was not economically viable even then to purchase and raise slaves and et cetera, et cetera. It was much cheaper just to hire someone to do a specific job and allow them to do their thing for the most part. But because, unfortunately, cotton became a big booming industry, effectively, for the most part, in the South, and being in this agrarian culture. Sorry, I'm having gastrointestinal problems. I do apologize. Being this agrarian culture, that was much more fundamentally needing to have a large contingent of slaves. Because I look at it this way. It's like, if you have one person that you can hire versus one slave that you have to clothe, feed, et cetera, and house, it's much more economically, you just might just hire the person. It's just going to be much easier that way. But if you can have, say, 100 slaves versus having to pay 100 different people, that's a bit of a different issue. And then you can just downplay, unfortunately, the whole slave housing, et cetera, et cetera. And if you can get them to work much harder than you would, say, a normal white person that you actually would have to pay a lot more. They're not going to be as efficient. It is what it is. I mean, the cotton gins basically just forced slavery in the South, economically speaking, and it's very tough. Because I don't think the initial reality of what people perceive as a slavery is because of, the white man's all bad. I just think, money plays a big role in it. And I think a lot of them are just driven by this financial incentive for the most part. And I think once the generation of the founding fathers is kind of gone, which really begins at this point, and you have this generation that's built under, freedom, etc., independence, really taking the words of the document of the Declaration of Independence and Constitution to, sovereignty of the white man, interpreting it in that particular way. Because I make a point too sometimes that the way slaves are treated between the era of the founding fathers versus this pre-Civil War era, the first generation that's born under that's born under independence, like 1790 on, it's very different, because it's not 12 years a slave during Washington's time as president. It's not. Does that make it right? No. I'm just saying that 12 years a slave specifically happens around this particular point in time for a reason. And there's like 15 different other reasons, but I would say the three main ones is socially, for obvious reasons that, the white man thinks he's better than the black man, and the black man isn't able or capable of doing anything, and then economically and politically. And the Missouri Compromise that's about to occur in 1820 is a compromise that is specifically a political reasoning for it. You see, you have to understand that the president can do a lot of things, but most of the laws, most legislation really occurs in the House, both the House of Representatives and the Senate for the most part. So if you're actually going to get things passed, get things done, you want to have some relative superiority for the most part within the House itself. So, like I said before in the Madison episode, there was a big problem because if you had a small state, because initially the initial constitution only had one House of Representatives, and that was it, and that was going to be based on population, but the smaller states who weren't going to have a bigger population were going to be basically taken over by the bigger states, and the states' rights issue, et cetera, et cetera. So they basically compromised with the New Jersey plan to create the second House of Representatives, or known as the Senate. That's going to be based on nothing, just you get 2 people per state, that's it. And you have to understand that if you're a free state, you're going to vote in that particular way of freedom, and if you're a slave state, you're going to vote in that particular way for slavery. So, Missouri, for the most part, it's equal right now. I think there's about 12 states for North and South, and it's a perfect balance between how many people in the Senate, for instance, all like 24 members of the South in the Senate are for the slavery, 24 in the North, and Missouri is in particular in a bit of a compromising position because at least the territory that it is specifically is being argued for that specific territory, which is both in the North and the South, and they're trying to argue whether Missouri is going to be a slave state or a free state. So before we get to the Missouri Compromise, a couple things do happen. This is around the time when the University of Virginia effectively ends up getting founded. Maine effectively breaks off from Massachusetts and it becomes their own territory and state. A lot of stuff happens, actually. I take that back. 1819 is when a lot of shit hits the fan, for the most part, after 2 peaceful years for Monroe. First, the Transcontinental Treaty gets signed. Most people would know it as the Adams-Onis Treaty. Long story short, this basically allows us to buy Florida for $5 million, and Jackson's basically been there the entire time and just holding that strategic position, and basically putting Spain in a very awkward position, because we can either conquer them at this point because it's reached that particular apex, or we being the better country Just fuck it. We'll just buy it from you. We don't want more conflict whatsoever. So they basically agree, okay, here, $5 million. We'll give you this territory. And you know what? Fine. And actually, America's kind of low-key like, you know what, give us that Oregon territory too. And Spain's like, what the hell? And he's like, hey, don't make us fight it. And fine. So we also get the Oregon territory as well. Anyways, immediately after that too, what I would probably say is another relatively big court case is McCulloch versus Maryland. Still John Marshall is the Supreme Court Justice, and it's a unanimous decision where the court finds that the states cannot tax federal agencies. And a lot of people need to understand that this is, in particular, I don't want to say a big case, but it's a notable case because it's just further expansion of federal powers over states' rights. So if you want to have people freak out who are states' rights individuals, then just look at this specific treaty. So the Missouri Compromise really begins early in 1819, probably February, March. It starts when James Talmadge Jr., he introduces this amendment to the Missouri during the whole Missouri statehood, where he proposes that basically any further territory that is created is going to outlaw slavery. Because in fairness, slavery at this point for a lot of other countries, it's basically already been outlawed. And we are like one of the last remnant countries outside of maybe Brazil and a couple of other smaller notable nations that really legally outlaw slavery. And he presents this to the House floor, and everyone's like, "Oh my God!" And it's complicated for numerous reasons. One, there's already slaves in Missouri and the Missouri Territory, so are they free? So then, are you going to compensate the farmers and the slave owners? I mean, how is it going to work? It's infringement on their rights, unfortunately, because this is legal, and the South isn't going to like it because it's just more of a continuation, at least in their perspective, on their infringement of states' rights. So, like I said before, the whole McCulloch Treaty or court case isn't going to help with that either. So, you have to understand, this entire discussion really takes a very long time, okay? Because at this point, America has, 11 free and 11 slave states at this point, where Missouri, for the most part, they just barely break the qualifications, and they effectively try to become a state for themselves. So it takes some time, and ultimately, Missouri wishes to effectively become a slave state. No one in the North is happy about that, because then that would just mean that the Democratic Republican people and the Southerners and the Democrats are going to have a majority in the South, in the Senate, and probably even the House too, and they're just not happy. So effectively, what ends up happening is, well, you know what? This specific territory, we can kind of finagle some requirements there, and we'll actually get that state to be a free state too. Yay! Not really. I'm kind of joking here. But anyways, like I said before, Maine effectively became its own territory. It's kind of complicated. It didn't just become a territory. It was kind of contested for the most part, and there was a bunch of people there, and that's an entirely complicated story that I really don't even want to go into, because I think the Missouri Compromise is really interesting, and I think it just deserves its own episode, to be honest with you, to go into full details into the specific, into at least the specifics of this event. But for the most part, effectively what happens is they're arguing about just a couple specific things. One, if Missouri is going to be a slave state, then we have to have a free state, which Maine effectively, basically they're just like, hey, we'll volunteer. We'll get enough people here at enough of a time. And then number two, well, because first off, the other big issue too is the whole, the slave being the 3/5 person. Technically, that's been kind of a part of the Constitution in a lot of ways. And I think it might be in one of the articles, but I'm not technically positive. For the most part, effectively, legislatively speaking, that a slave was unfortunately equal to 3/5 of a person, and in terms of population and growth, that just meant that there was going to be potential for more House members. So they're not happy about that either. So they're trying to work things out for the most part, in which case they ultimately end up coming to the agreement of the 3630 parallel, which effectively is that line right across where right on the country that effectively divides the North and the South. Any state below this, can freely be a slave state, and et cetera, et cetera. And a northern state, et cetera, above this line is going to be basically a free state. They basically just debate about this for, I guess, the better part of, a full year, on the floor for the most part. And fierce debate going back and forth between numerous different groups of people. And a young, I believe he might be a senator, or I don't know if he was still Speaker of the House at this point, Henry Clay, who's going to be he's one of the more fascinating historical politicians this entire country's ever had. He ends up being the lead individual and basically trying to bridge the gap between the two different factions within the actual Congress itself. Monroe doesn't really speak in on this. He kind of just lets people really do their own thing and solve their own problems. And I think he kind of embodies this, this idea of what the Founding Fathers effectively ended up doing after, they just let people figure it out themselves and just let people govern and let, popular sovereignty and personal independence and sovereignty really just reign forward and let people decide what they want to do. And that's Monroe for the most part, just like with Madison and all the other presidents too. Anyways, a lot of people in a lot of ways kind of understand that civil war is kind of going to happen. I think a lot of people, this compromise ultimately isn't going to be something that's going to last, because there's going to be more territories coming. If you're just a fortune teller, you're probably betting I'd probably say plus or minus 20 years, civil war is going to occur, or some type of confrontation that is really going to escalate for the most part. The fact that they won't have serious confrontation, I'd probably say, until, John Brown and all them for the next 20, 30 years, I think is a testament to how hard they've effectively really tried to make peace with one another for the most part. And it's really difficult, but ultimately they signed it in March of 1820, the actual Missouri Compromise, with Henry Clay basically leading the charge on the mediating pretty much everything for the most part. Maine soon becomes a state afterwards, specifically being the 23rd state of the Union. Missouri would effectively end up becoming a state soon after, in August officially. So, what happens after the Missouri Compromise? Well, there's an election coming up in 1820, and Monroe is going to go for it in re-election. You want to talk about an easy presidency, a very easy presidency, if you want to, for sure, in relative comparison to his buddy, James Madison. This is fucking cakewalking for the most part. Don't get me wrong, Monroe's getting old, he's showing some gray, he's still wearing his, high, pantyhose and whatnot, and a gray wig, and still looking like he's dressing from 1790, etc. This guy, I can't think of an equivalent for James Monroe of his particular time and era. But, he's just doing his thing. So he decides he's going to run again. The presidency is really tough on him, at least physically, because, he's just getting old, and, it's it might be peaceful, but still stressful. And it's mainly stressful for his family, and his wife ends up getting really sick at times during his presidency, and she really can't fulfill a lot of the duties, so his daughter ends up taking over on certain occasions, and he decides he's going to run for one last term and then just retire officially after that, when he's about, in his early to mid 60s. So I don't think I really talked about this as much as I probably should have, but by this point in time, it's effectively a one-party system. The Federalists have basically died out, and they've basically got rid of all their support, and they've given up. They've all coalesced either into the Democratic Republican Party, or they've become independent, and the party itself is gone. And this is part of the reason why this is the era of good feelings. There's really no partisan politics, and people were just going to be doing their thing and voting for who they want to vote for. It's kind of beautiful, and it's kind of scary in a lot of ways, because there's really no opposition, which can be good and it can be bad, and you just have to hope you have really good members and really good individuals that do the right thing. Thankfully, Monroe would leave after his second term because he's a good man. And it's times like this that I think is really interesting when I look back in our country's history and the fact that we could have had a dictator any time, and we really haven't. The closest, honestly, is FDR, and he's a complicated person. I can't wait to get to him. But for the most part, the election of 1820, there's no party. There's no other party that's really going to get any sort of real vote or real opportunity to really combat Monroe. Despite the economic problems, he's very popular. He's very popular because he's getting things done. At the very least, getting Florida. The economy is really tough, but I don't think they're really blaming him because there's nothing that he's doing specifically. And, people are kind of just looking at this and kind of just being like, you know what, it's pretty peaceful. We're kind of just chilling. It's technically speaking kind of like the Second Great Awakening time still with, the explosion of religion, etc., etc. And I think this is a very interesting point in our country's history. People are just peaceful, And don't get me wrong, there's international factors that are kind of poking their head in. Britain's still kind of just like, they're still kind of wary of us. And then, all the other countries in Europe, they're going through their own little bit of, economic and socially, cultural, and political revolutions. But, aside from that, America's truly peaceful. And that's very weird to say. It's a very, very peaceful time. Anyways, the election of 1820, Monroe runs unopposed. Aside from Washington, this is the only time in this country's history that any other president has run unopposed. No one even attempts to challenge him because he's just going to win in a landslide. And this is going to be a really short one. He did win a landslide. He basically won almost all the electoral votes. One person chose not to elect him. There's a bunch of different reasons why. Most famous story is just because they wanted Washington to be the only president to be technically the one that gets the 100% of the electoral vote. I just think I honestly am more leaning towards that one elector just did not want to. He just did not like Monroe, because Monroe would, despite being a good person with a good soul, etc., etc. He was quiet. He was a bit standoffish and can be extremely confrontational. So I'm just probably gonna guess that person just didn't like him. Anyways, long story short, James Monroe would begin his second term as a president in 1820. So what happens during this time when Monroe is president? What happens during his second term? So a lot of things do happen for the most part. First and foremost, Monroe signs the Military Establishment Act. He's trying to reduce the military manpower for the most part. There's a whole bunch of different reasons for this, the reduction of military. At least politically speaking, it's just so that he can go on to the actual table itself and go into more, negotiations with internationally with a whole bunch of different countries and not appear like I'm going to threaten you with manpower and war. I'm going to just basically be like, hey man, we come here in peace, we don't want anything, etc., etc. And at this particular time, it's kind of understandable, most notably with the reality of Europe being in kind of a little bit of a chaotic period in time. And we just want to establish just trade for the most part. Let's just be normalize all this shit. And it kind of works. The economy slowly, but surely begins really improving around this point. It's still going to be the Panic of 1819, which really lasts until probably around John Quincy Adams' presidency, and really goes away 100% by the time Andrew Jackson becomes president. But for the most part, it's improving, and improving trade is really on the forefront of Monroe's basically second term. We've been focusing on a whole bunch of other shit. I gotta really do something about this economy, because I thought the economy itself would kind of improve, and it really hasn't for the most part. It's still tough. People are still in debt, and people aren't willing to take the risk to, take on loans and whatnot that they are eventually going to have to owe. So, a couple other notable things do happen. First and foremost, the Cumberland Road bill. It's basically kind of like one of these internal improvement bills. I just found that really interesting, because he's more of a states' rights individual, and while he does want the actual internal improvements eventually, he just doesn't think it should be a federal issue. And this is why I think like he's fascinating, because he'll allow some things, but some things he's kind of just like, okay, you know what, we'll just do our own little, if it's going to let Virginia decide what's going to happen. Jefferson, technically speaking, was a big reason why this was really started for the most part, at the very least in terms of the beginnings of interstate commerce, And you have to understand, too, that I'm not saying that it wasn't a necessary thing, but, I mean, if you had the rivers, and, I mean, this would be the beginnings of, like, the buildings from the railroads, too, at this point, or at least the variations of it. Have you seen what the railroads looked like back then? It's kind of funny, because it basically just looks like a train that's being pulled by a carriage, and it's really fascinating. Anyways, for trade, if you have the rivers, then you're good, because most rivers would be, the prime things from the prime locations. I mean, that's why it was so big to have the Erie Canal built, because that was just going to help you go in and out quickly to trade, and a whole bunch of other canals that would go into the west. Rivers were the way to go. They were the quickest, fastest way to get to point A to point B, and roads and interstate commerce specifically were not a big priority for a lot of these people back then. So around this time, too, a whole bunch of other countries, like I said before, are getting their independence, doing the whole liberating themselves. I'm going to eat, pray, love myself into my own, personal, yada, yada, whatever you want to call it. Anyways, South America is a big Spanish territory, and it just so happens that in the last couple years too, a lot of the Spanish countries have been really declaring their independence. Simón Bolívar, for instance, is a well-known figure down there who become one of the dictators of many of the countries actually down there. I think like Colombia, Venezuela, a whole bunch of them, and everyone's really trying to be free, and notably Mexico will eventually declare their independence, I think in 1822, 1823. And it's really interesting because this is a big point. This is a big moment, at least for Monroe, in what he's going to decide to do, because Spain might want to be the country that's just going to try and take control of these countries and take it back, and he doesn't want that, because if he gets them back, then especially with Mexico being a free independent nation, it's not, he wants to be able to have Mexico on his side rather than being a potential Spanish territory that's going to be hostile towards them. And not to mention too, maybe Mexico, and this is where Texas really becomes a very interesting place. But he's also, thinking ahead too. Like, if the other countries, for instance, all these Spanish territories themselves are going to be free and independent, maybe we should probably help them. But if we don't help them, then we got to make sure that they don't fall back into imperialistic hands. Like maybe Britain doesn't come in, or France, or Russia, or the Dutch Republic, or the rising Prussian people, for the most part, the Ottoman Empire that's rising, are going to, start taking these countries and start picking them off little by little, because it's defensive, and it's also, we might want to influence these countries in our own particular way. I think that's really interesting, and he's thinking about this, and he's been thinking about this for quite some time, and this is eventually when he becomes James Monroe, the one thing that he's absolutely known for, which would effectively be his Monroe Doctrine. His Monroe Doctrine is it's pretty simple, if I'm going to be 100% honest with you. It's just him basically saying, hey, Europe, get the fuck out of America, and North and South, this is kind of our territory. That's basically it. That's the entirety of the Monroe Doctrine. There's no, interesting little tidbits or facts from it, other than just, this is our territory. It has a fascinating backstory, because Monroe basically tells us in a I guess like monthly congressional meeting just randomly in Congress, and he's just like, so let's just make sure Europe's out of here, guys. And yeah, okay. And people kind of just like, what? what was that, James? Like, I'm just saying, gotta make sure Europe's out of America. You know what I'm saying? And like, okay, cool. Yeah, I guess. But effectively ends up becoming a pretty well-known speech and the most well-known moment of his entire presidency. So, how does it happen? Well, like I said, he's been thinking about this. He's been trying to figure out what he's going to be doing around with Europe and the interventions and whatnot. So he calls his cabinet, and he's basically just like, hey guys, I should probably do something, right? And they're basically kind of just, yeah, you should probably, okay, yeah, I kind of agree. You should probably, maybe make a declaration or something. Spain, yeah, tell them that, if we should just be friends. Probably shouldn't say anything, I guess. I don't know. Maybe, what do you think, guys? We should probably try to be friends with Spain and probably try to make relations. So we probably shouldn't make any significant declarations, James. Just saying, And I guess you could say that everyone was in agreement except one person, and that's John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams is like, throw my dick on the table real quick and just say we should just say no. They are declaring their independence, and if anyone's going to basically, we're going to recognize them as their own sovereign nations, and if anyone attempts to interfere with us and in this particular territory, they will feel our wrath. So, yeah. And in fairness, you could technically say that a lot of this really is John Quincy Adams's specific address, and in some ways, I think you can absolutely say that. At least a lot of what Monroe says is really articulated, and I would probably say John Quincy Adams' words for the most part. That being said, in fairness to Monroe, he's been thinking about this for quite a long time. He's a really good leader, at the very least, in terms of finding the right people, disseminating ideas, etc., and trying to find the right thing to do. And he actually gives it in the 7th annual address to Congress. It's actually a pretty interesting speech. So if you get a chance to read it, get a chance to read it. So basically, that's just all he's dealing with from 1821 to 1823. And you're probably asking what happens during the last year of his presidency. Well, a couple things. Because he's basically entering, unfortunately, the twilight of his life and his career. Because he knows that once he leaves this, he's done. And he's going to enjoy retirement with his wife, etc., and be a grandfather and enjoy the fruits of his labor, I guess you could say. First and foremost, the country economically is trying to improve, They were on the right path, but things are starting to kind of stagnate a little bit for the most part. The South's improving. The North is somewhat struggling. So effectively, which requires Monroe to implement the tariff of 1824. It's known as a protectionist tariff, which basically means that the South can't, export their goods and services, etc., to other countries at a cheaper rate. They're gonna have to probably go through America and Northern industry in order to help facilitate the North and the South. You have to understand too, like the Civil War is really, I think, both on slavery and an economic war, because a lot of these tariffs, a lot of these things, basically just keep stoking that fire, and it keeps screwing up a lot of things for Southern farmers and the entire agricultural culture. I guess you could say, in agrarian society. Although in fairness, the North's kind of on the right track. They're just going about it in the complete worst way about it to go about it. And this, because the big problem too was there was a bunch of people protesting. In fact, some of the first protests I would actually the first strikes, I guess you could say, really start occurring. Notably, the female workers in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, just striking out of their textile mill and just saying, we're not doing this anymore. And it's a real problem, a real struggle. And the only other thing I can really note of is the other Supreme Court case, the Gibbons Ogden case. Supreme Court ruled that the federal government controls interstate commerce for the most part, which I always think is really interesting. I just wrote that down, for the most part, that the federal government continuing to take control. So just keep those in mind, because it just keeps, just little by little, it takes inch by inch, and I think people need to be cognizant and aware of what's happening within this country even today. Anyways, I'm just going to be level with you and be honest. Monroe's presidency is generally very boring, aside from the Missouri Compromise and some of the actual federal stuff that happens. Not a lot of stuff happens. It's truly an era of good feelings. Nothing really interesting occurs, especially during his second term. I mean, the most notable thing is Marquis de Lafayette basically makes a grand visit to James Monroe. They're really good friends, actually. They met during the war. They met during the occupation. And when Lafayette got hurt, Monroe was basically there by his side. He's like, "Hey, yo, you Frenchman, you good, buddy?" And my friend Lafayette's like, "I am good. You're Monroe. You're Monroe, am I right?" They became buddies, and they actually become very close friends. And obviously, earlier, Monroe and his wife mainly, saves Lafayette's wife, saves her life during the entire French Revolution. So that should be noted as well. Monroe basically ends his presidency. It's very clear he's not going to seek re-election. He basically abdicates and just leaves, which unfortunately ends up, I guess, being a very tricky point in history, because him not running for a third term, or really opens up what effectively will be the shit show that is the election of 1824, that I'm going to go into such a big deep dive into when I talk about John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. On both sides, surprisingly. It's going to be a really beautiful thing to really go into. Election of 1824 is coming up, and Monroe knows that the world's going to be very different after this. And I think that's really interesting, because he sees this happening, and that's why he lets people know early, so that they can make their conscientious choices. This election really changes the world and this country in many ways, shape, and form. And it should be noted that I can't go. I have to go into its own deep dive. This is one of the very few elections that, if I was going to do an episode, it'd probably be like 3 hours long, because there's so many details that go into this, so many backstories that go into this. I genuinely cannot do this episode do this election justice. Monroe sees this happening, but he doesn't care. He's just going to enjoy the twilight of his life and basically just retire. So how would I rank Monroe's presidency, and how would I understand Monroe's presidency? And it's a complicated one, because I look at it in this particular perspective, okay? A lot of people, and I want to use actually a future president as an example, because a lot of people look at, say, what constitutes a good president, and for me, it's one of two things. It's one that, and again, I don't think you should rank presidents, and I don't think, you can really debate who is the best and who isn't the best, or how good a president actually is, or how bad a president actually is. It's up to interpretation, really. So it's very subjective. That being said, I think there's maybe one or two things I would probably say that I think really encapsulate what makes a good president. And I think the first is, when shit hits the fan, will you make the right decision and be able to stand up and go along with that particular decision for the most part? I think Abraham Lincoln has a very complicated presidency when you take away, the whole Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation, and all that. And I just think he has a lot of issues in terms of policy for the most part. But that being said, what he was able to do and achieve in basically keeping this union together, I don't think there's any other president that deserves a top 3 spot other than Abraham Lincoln, regardless of what I feel about him. And then the other one, which I think kind of goes with Monroe, and the one that I want to talk about too, is Calvin Coolidge. Because Calvin Coolidge doesn't really get ranked up there with the best presidents, and that's because, unfortunately, he oversees a relatively economically vibrant and peaceful time in this country's history where he doesn't really start anything, doesn't start wars, doesn't do anything. He's not trying to save people. He's just trying to do what's best for the constituents in this country, and then he just leaves. Monroe is kind of that in a lot of ways, where despite the economic problems in this country, where the Panic of 1819 really is a bit of an issue, the truth and reality is that it was peaceful. And I think when it's peacetime, you should have peacetime. Does that make any sense? I mean, imagine him just basically being like, hey, we should probably go into Mexico and show them our love and respect, etc., etc., or go to war with Spain to basically just take over Florida, Understand that I think it's fascinating. And his presidency is always ranked relatively low for the most part, and I think they kind of just put into, he served a peaceful time, but the economy is bad, but at the same time, like, it's peaceful because Monroe, in a lot of ways, made it very peaceful. He kind of just let people sort out their own problems. He wasn't going to take sides. He just let things happen and let the country go with whatever the country was going to go. And I'm not saying we need a libertarian president by any stretch of the imagination, But I will say that at the very least, economically speaking, socially speaking, when you just let the people do what they will and not force it upon them in situations where it should not be forced upon, people can tend to sort themselves out and sort things out. And I think Monroe understood that pretty fucking well. He wasn't going to do anything crazy. And I think Madison kind of understood that, but unfortunately he got a war, so it's a little bit difficult to really assess his presidency in a lot of ways because that was dominated by the war. I think Monroe was an okay president. It wasn't anything particularly special, and I think for what was asked of him, I thought he did okay, Some people kind of get it easy, and in fairness, when you see Monroe as the Secretary of State, when he basically just takes over, because when he becomes Secretary of State, he takes over. He's basically just laying his dick down and basically being like, Madison, we're doing these things, and Madison's like, okay, fuck it, just do what you gotta do, and he basically does. If anyone was going to basically handle stress in a particular situation and rise up to an occasion, it's Monroe. But finally, Monroe, at the age of roughly around 64, 63, 64, 65, he effectively retires from politics and retires from the government and retires for good with his wife. So, what happens when James Monroe retires in 1824? Well, he joins his old buddy James Madison. He goes home. First and foremost, he goes home and he serves along the board of visitors in the University of Virginia. Thomas Jefferson, he's getting old. He effectively retires at this point, gives basically the reins to James Madison and James Monroe to continue running the University of Virginia. Money was a problem for James Monroe because the biggest problem with James Monroe as a farmer, if anything, was that if he wasn't there, then the plantation was never going to be lucrative because he was never going to be on top of it as well as he could have if he was going to be there, And that was a big problem because he wasn't a good person. Ironically, I think he was actually a pretty good person to choose people to actually do functions in a job. But when it came to basically him choosing the good people to do a specific job for him on his farm, it wasn't very good. His plantation effectively would always have problems from this point on, and it's not like the plantation always was successful. They'd have lulls, they'd go have ups and downs, but it was so apparent that by the time he came back, that his finances just weren't very good, I guess you could say. And he works for the next couple years, even though his health is declining, his wife's health is declining, trying to really rebuild the plantation. It's also around this time, too, he ends up joining the Virginia Constitutional Convention as a delegate. Money he's basically being paid to do this, and he still loves the political gain. It's just something small that he's wanting to do, and they're trying to amend the Constitution, the Virginia Constitution, to include more rights and take away some things. You know how it goes. He's very apolitical here. He's just more of a personal little thing that he's just doing. And eventually, while joining the Virginia Constitution, and he would be a part of this for a little bit, for some time, just being bored out of his mind, I would probably assume. His wife's health, unfortunately, just continues to really deteriorate. And I don't know the whole story, but all I know is that one day, while she's basically just super sick, she ends up falling into the fireplace. Something happens. She ends up dying afterwards. I feel bad for laughing. It's just, who falls in a fucking fireplace? I mean, I don't know. Anyways, she effectively will die in 1830 at a relatively pretty young age. I think she may have been in her early 60s around this particular point, maybe late 50s. And James Monroe obviously is heartbroken. Their marriage was solid, and they did love each other and genuinely care about each other, and they probably had one of the strongest genuine partnerships overall of any parent or not parent husband-wife duo for the most part. So his health is also failing, and he's despondent. He's all sad and shit. And the farm isn't doing too well either, so he ends up deciding, you know what, fuck it, I'm just gonna leave. So I forgot if he actually sells the farm or if he gives it to another family member, but he ends up leaving and staying with his eldest daughter Eliza, and her husband. And the husband's probably just like, oh yeah, it's just the fucking president's in my house. Oh, oh god, yeah. James Monroe could probably still kick his ass because he's just James Monroe. But his health just quickly deteriorates. I mean, age just gets to you, pneumonia, and especially when you're at a much older age at that particular point, if you can survive some illnesses just take it, pneumonia, etc., 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 and, people have their time and people have their moment. So it was around 1831, Monroe just continues to deteriorate. He's basically bedridden at this point, and it's very likely that he's going to die. And the Monroe is just basically probably thinking to himself, low-key, wouldn't that be something if I could just survive a couple more days? And you know what? He does. James Monroe, unfortunately, dies on July 4th, 1831, 55 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. He is the third president to die on July 4th, the first two being John Adams and Thomas Jefferson on the same day. No one knows about this. We've had like 3 presidents that have done this. I think I might be wrong. I'm pretty sure one more did, but who knows? 3 out of the first 5 died on July 4th. I think it's interesting. And James Madison actually almost tried to do it too. He actually had the opportunity to have his life extended, basically through they were just going to give him crack to survive 6 more days. So I think he died on June 28th or late June for the most part. So, well, that would have been something. That would have been really fascinating and interesting. James Monroe dies and leaves this world, and leaves all the possessions or whatnot to his family that effectively gets lost throughout time and history as we know it today. And that's James Monroe, our 5th president of the United States of America, and an interesting one. There are people who have had fascinating, deep, long, storied lives, and when you look at a lot of these particular individuals, there are some that have more stories and more incredibleness, and have been a part of a lot of different things that I think it's really fascinating to look at. And Monroe is one of these particular individuals and one of these particular people. So I guess I'm just asking you to work with me as I form out my thoughts. This one might actually take a while. I've read, there's a lot of things about Monroe that either I'm just not thinking of, because I've read Monroe, ironically, is probably the one president I read the most on, surprisingly. And not just books and biographies. I've read a shit ton of research papers trying to decipher and figure out, the Monroe presidency and what Monroe represents in this country's history and just overall what he represents for the founding fathers. And a lot of people always point to, he's kind of the end, He's the end of the founding legacy. And I think in a lot of ways he knew that. So I think he wanted to really be the person to embody that spirit and be that person to really embody what it meant to be a founding father and what it meant to be someone who fought in the revolution, who influenced, the people of Washington in a lot of ways, shape, and form. It's quite sad. And I don't, in a lot of ways, I don't think anyone really could have been the last one like Monroe was when he became president. Excuse me. The founding fathers end with Monroe. That's just a fact. You can argue with John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson fought in the war, but I feel like you have to actually be part of the actual legislature and really have a substantial impact within the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution itself in order to really be, a founding father in that particular way, shape, and form. That's why Monroe kind of barely makes it, in my views, but it's undoubtedly he's one of the great founding fathers and one that just gets lost in history, unfortunately. And he has a fantastic, fascinating history. And it's kind of like John Quincy Adams, ironically, who is the Secretary of State, who's just a part of so many moments in American and world history that, you kind of just forget, oh, yeah, he was there. Oh, yeah. Monroe was there. He fought in the Revolution. He was there when the whole French Revolution was occurring. He was there. Fighting in the war, or not fighting in the war, but, leading the war of 1812. And he was there during the whole Missouri Compromise. He covers a lot of ground and a lot of history. And I think a lot of people always point to Monroe in particular as being this end to the founding generation. But I would like to point something out, and that I think he is the beginning of the modern America in a lot of ways. Like, I look at it this way. The party ends up being consolidated into the Democratic Republican Party that would eventually become the Democratic Party. And true peace is really achieved, I guess you could say, for the first time in Monroe's presidency. And he showed me a couple of things that I would probably say is fascinating, because I would look at Monroe in the sense of he showed me what Washington did can be done. Be a bipartisan president and be one that's actually going to do the things that are going to benefit America. And I think that's really interesting and really fascinating to really think about and look at. Monroe is really the beginning of America in a lot of instances, in a lot of ways. I think the modern interpretation of America really begins here, because the Revolutionary War, the beginnings and the foundation of this country is set when Monroe becomes president. And he solidifies that foundation beyond anything that can even be fundamentally recognized. And Monroe is the president, the last founding father, and the president that is America. And that's how I think Monroe should be thought about and should be looked at. A very underrated founding father and president, I would probably say, who has a lot of problems. He's not a perfect individual, not a perfect encapsulation by any means of an individual. He owned slaves. He made no, he made no excuses for it, though. Little tidbit, by the way, he's one of the few people who started the, I forgot what it was. I think it might have been like a bit of an emancipation, I guess you could say, how do I explain it? Club? I don't even know what, foundation, whatever you want to call it. Basically, he's one of the leading people that actually founded and colonized a specific part of Africa to send emancipated slaves so that they can actually go back home, I guess you could say, to live their lives. And I think that country is Liberia, with the capital of Monrovia, named after James Monroe. So, whatever your opinion is of that, he's giving them an opportunity But, who wants to go to Africa? I certainly don't. Monroe is really a good president, a really good man. History has a very interesting way of, kind of hiding a lot of these great figures over time. And you ponder why some of these guys don't get as much notoriety or reputation as much as much as the others. Like I look, 100 years from now, and what I think people are going to always look at as the big moments within a particular country's history, Just if that makes any particular sense. Like, we all know the Monroe Doctrine, but we all know the Declaration of Independence. We all know the Louisiana Purchase. We know those big things, but, we really don't know much about the Monroe Doctrine. We don't know much about other presidents and other particular individuals. And I guess I'm trying to say is history works in a very fascinating way where a lot of these people, a lot of these presidents, and a lot of these men don't really get the reputation and the notoriety and the positive praise that they usually probably should get. And in fairness, I think Monroe is a very fascinating one. I mean, every documentary I read, or not read, every biography I read or every documentary I watch, they're all fascinating. I think because they're all trying to figure out James Monroe in a very unique way, because he's such a fascinating person. He kind of keeps things close to the chest, and you're really just trying to figure out who he is, And I think you kind of learned that from George Washington, because George Washington would always keep things very close to the chest too. That's why I think Monroe really should be up there. He's all the great qualities, some problems obviously, but a lot of the great qualities of all the founding fathers and what they represented for the most part. And that's why and that's the fundamental reason why I think, there could really have been no other founding father president that would have really ended this era. It's quite sad though. Once Monroe leaves, it's kind of it. The founding generation, one of the greatest generations of men to have ever men and women actually, to really ever achieve any semblance of greatness, is over with Monroe. America begins in full once Monroe leaves office. Thank you guys. It's a very fascinating ending that I'm trying to do, and I hope you guys listen to the next episode. Thank you very much.